Okay, this is the first Trophy Gold Writers Workshop. I'm going to, before I kind of get into the details of what we're going to be doing today, I want to just do introductions for everyone. I'm going to start with myself. So my name is Jason. I am the publisher of Trophy, and I am the founder of the Gauntlet gaming community and the owner of, or the head of Gauntlet Publishing. I host a couple of well-regarded podcasts, one about Trophy, and in particular, one about the OSR called Fear of the Black Dragon. And yeah, I really love Trophy. I have been in love with it since 2 years ago or whatever it was when Jesse first brought the idea to me. And I've just been so delighted with how it's grown and how people have embraced it. And we are furiously working to get the Kickstarter finished. You have no idea how insane that is. But it's good, fun work, and we're having a good time with it. We're joined today on the call by Jesse Ross, the author of Trophy Gold, as well as Gabriel Robinson, who is a pretty prolific trophy author, both of Rooted Trophy Games and Trophy Incursions, and the winner of the Trophy Gold contest last year. So why don't we just, I want to go to you two. Jesse, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi. Jesse Ross. I use he, him pronouns. I don't know why I'm here. I don't know. No, I am the creator of Trophy and am super excited to chat all about your very cool incursions that you're working on. I don't know. Do you want to know anything else about me? I'm a Libra.
Good.
Yes, I don't
Works
know.
for me. Gabriel?
I'm Gabriel. I use he, him pronouns. Relatively new to RPG writing in general, just kind of got into it in the last couple of years and kind of started a lot with the Trophy Loom crowdsourcing. So getting to write those cool little entries just kind of drew me in, and then kind of kept going and writing as much as Jason and Jess would let me for the books. So it's been a blast. And
turns out to be a huge amount, actually.
Yeah, keep encouraging me. So I'm here again. So it's a lot of fun. Glad to be here.
Awesome, thank you. Now let's kind of introduce everybody on the call. When I call on you, please say your name, your pronouns, anything else you'd like for us to know about you. If you have published some Trophy stuff, that's great. If you have a social media hook you want to share, or if you have published other things you want us to know about, just anything really. And then importantly, I want you to tell us the name of the thing you're working on, if you have something you're working on. If not, that's okay too, just say so. But the name of the incursion you're working on, and importantly, extra importantly, what are the characters doing in your incursion? Like, what is the thing they're doing? That's kind of, I think that'll kind of help us at least understand a real basic level your incursion, whether we've kind of read it or not. So and I also think it's just helpful in general to think about your RPG writing in terms of like design goals. And to me, a major design goal of Trophy Incursion is, what are the treasure hunters doing on this incursion? What are they meant to be accomplishing? So I'm going to go in the order of my grid, and that is Colin. So Colin.
Hi, my name is Colin Downing. I use he, him pronouns. I'm also really new to RPG writing and RPG. I've never actually played one. I ran into Trophy on the Kickstarter, and I actually love the artwork so much and saw the contest and thought it just looked like a really fun opportunity. And so I'm still kind of learning how the community works and how incursions work, and it's just fascinating. I love the creativity of this thing, and it's just been so much fun to write. So it's been a nice thing to do during COVID lockdown and all that, to live in these fantasy worlds. The incursion that I'm working on right now is Bara Thrum. It was the one I threw into the gold contest last year, but I and a friend are working at publishing for the first time, so we go by Lunaire and Locke on Itch and some other places. But I was hoping to polish this one up so as we can start doing the graphic design and the drawings and stuff. I'd just love to see what people think of it, because I think it shows in some ways at this point that it was my very first attempt at things. And I'm just excited to learn from. I just want to be all of you when I grow up someday. So thanks for having me.
Well, if I can ask again, Colin, what are the characters doing in Barthroom? Like, what is
Oh,
the
yeah.
sort of thing?
So in this incursion, they have basically gotten a lead on this bizarre, I think I call it like disgusting gold or something. It's this gold that it's just greed that brings them to the valley, but they kind of discover this isolated valley that is a very strange source of it, and some monsters and this kind of monster who set up a little false religion in this isolated valley. So they can kind of go in and just get what they can and get back out, or they can start recognizing some of the injustice here and kind of fight to free this valley if they choose. But just kind of a big weird playground was kind of my hope. But yeah, greed, I think, is what got them there. Just this unusual gold is what got them into trouble in the first place.
Awesome, thank you. All right, let me go to my my frequent co-conspirator in all things Brindlewood Bay, Alicia.
Hi, I'm Alicia. I use she or they pronouns. They're equally acceptable. Yes, I am leading the charge in Brindlewood Bay hacks, apparently. Chris just joked that I have written as much Brindlewood Bay as Jason maybe has.
Probably more than me, if I'm being honest.
So my whole life has been Brindlewood Bay recently. But beyond that, I don't know. I'm known for making a lot of family-friendly work or super political work. Anyone who's playing 5e, I'm sort of the co-head bitch in charge of Eat the Rich. Is another one of my things. And so anyway, I'm excited to dig into something new. I started this Trophy Gold incursion. Mine is The Woods Beyond. Last year for the contest, and then, pandemic, I just never finished it. So it literally is still in the state that it was in April of last year. And the characters are, I guess, searching for missing children in my weird, absurd little incursion.
Fantastic, thank you. Ryan.
Hey, did I get the audio working? Can you guys hear me? Okay. My name is Ryan. Go by he, him. Sort of just heard about Trophy for first time a few weeks ago, and I really wanted to just run with it and see if I can bring it into my games and, take it apart, hack it, all that. And I thought it was probably a good idea to sort of honor how it, quote unquote, ought to be run first, or at least get a bit of an idea. I wrote Last Days of Kova with my partner Ty, and in that, the treasure hunters are escaping a city which is facing a very the end of its days, a sacking, and they're going to have to decide whether they're saving themselves or saving the people they come across as well.
Awesome, thank you. Drew.
Hi, I'm Drew. I use he, him pronouns. I'm pretty new to RPGs and very new to writing for RPGs, but it's something I've always been interested in, and Trophy has really lit a bit of a creative spark in me. It's really great to play, really lovely meeting all sorts of cool, creative, fun people. And so I wanted to kind of get in on that with writing. And so to that end, I have been part of writing Immemorial, wherein the treasure hunters go on a kind of easy job, but end up getting a little bit more than they expected with a time loop, because those are always fun. And also a place of honor where, as usual, looking for treasure leads the treasure hunters to a tomb that turns out to also be more than what it first seems. And I'm excited to be here and learn from all these people. It'll be great. Thanks.
Awesome, thank you. Let's go to frequent trophy co-conspirator, Michael Van Vliet.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I use he, him pronouns. I contributed to the 3 trophy books, so Dark Gold and Loom. Had a ball doing that. I've written a number of incursions, stuff you may have heard of. A Warm and Pleasant Hum for Trophy Dark was a runner-up in the Trophy Dark incursion writing contest. That was one of the things that really kicked off my creatively getting back into RPGs within the last couple of years. Something about Trophy Dark just really spoke to me thematically and structurally, and Jesse set up such a great template to riff on. And I wrote Devil Aim for Me, which is a Weird West incursion, while I was waiting for Jesse to do his half of a gold incursion. I
Called out on the call. I love it.
Well, fully own that. Yep. I mean, I guess if my procrastination can make you make awesome things, then I should just procrastinate more.
Right. It's not really a call out when I'm so happy with what came out of it. Like, I wish more opportunities like that would sort of come along. So thank you, Jesse. You're so far like one of my greatest collaborators. So grateful. Let's skip the social media bit. I did the Alluring, which is probably one of the ones that Jason was calling out as being mostly done. I had it mostly put together for a Kickstarter project that didn't end up happening, but I keep tinkering with it. The idea came to me for the Trophy Gold contest that I didn't end up entering it into. And yeah, I've still got some pieces in there that I'm trying to figure out whether the problem is with the incursion or with me. So maybe we can all psychoanalyze that and fix it today. The Alluring was my attempt to wrestle with the structure of typical kick their ass, take their stuff adventuring, in that I'm so bored with that adventure style. So I created a scenario where the protagonists are entering a town that has been ravaged by plague, which I wrote pre-pandemic. That was another problem. Because I wanted them to be the sort of people who would just take stuff from dead people without them being there to be problematic about stealing from. Problem is I put NPCs in there and I'm not really sure how to use them. But that's the idea, is your scum going into an emptied out place full of crabs, actually. A lot of crabs and crab monsters and one big monster in a basement. So yeah, thanks everyone. It's great to be here and meet all of you.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Gabe.
Hi, everyone. Gabe McCormick, also he, him pronouns. And I'm kind of in that category of folks who played a lot of like second edition D&D when I was a kid, and then came back when 5e came out in some ways because it felt accessible. And in the last couple of years have been finding more indie games. And I think what I've really enjoyed is taking Trophy Gold and sharing it with people who have only played trad games, and kind of exposing them to what things can do narratively. And I've done that with Brindlewood Bay as well. And it's been just really rewarding to watch people kind of participate in the storytelling in a really different way. Like a few folks, this incursion, which is, what did I actually call it? Restore the Harvest, is it was one of two ideas I had during the Trophy Gold contest. I ended up finishing a different one. And this is really what I've called a reverse incursion, where instead of taking a bunch of stuff, the treasure hunters are trying to replace something and kind of heal, sort of a challenge to the dark, take everything, rob the tomb idea as well. Yeah, I just couldn't do a lot of the dark horror-y stuff during the pandemic. I wanted to see how we could do healing with Trophy Gold a little bit. And yeah, I'm also pretty new to writing. Like I've homebrewed a lot for D&D and like done a lot of world building stuff, but never actually published anything. So the Trophy Gold contest was the first time I like really put something together that someone else could read and work with. So I'm excited to do more of that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's go to Ty.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. I'm Ty. I go by he, him pronouns. I've been playing RPGs for a very long time. I think I started in middle school with second edition. None of us knew what we were doing, but it was fun. And then it sort of has spiraled out from there to just sort of consuming and playing as many RPGs as I can. I am in a long-term group with Ryan, and we wrote Last Days of COVID together. And yeah, like he already said, we wanted it to be, about escaping a city. So I think that was sort of the main thing, was like the treasure hunters start in the incursion to get out. And we wanted it to be sort of a decision. Do you beeline the easiest way, or do you sort of explore a bit and maybe gather more treasure and supplies? That's it, I think. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. I love all this 2E love. I'm a 2E kid forever, so that makes me happy. Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt. I go by he, him. I don't really have much of a creative resume here. I'm normally a programmer by trade, so this is a first foray into writing. But I've always been fascinated with RPGs, and I remember trying to program in middle school a AD&D emulation engine, which did not work very well considering my experience level at the time. I am working on Immemorial with Drew for this setup, and wanted to play sort of with ideas of normal time loop tropes, but also sort of challenge things like, how do you get treasure when you can't take anything with you? Like sort of break the normal, pick up everything and walk away with it sort of ideas.
Awesome, thank you. Let's go to the person I play games with every week now, Brian.
All right. I'm Brian Sago. I use the he pronoun. I kind of backed away from gaming, just kind of got lost in all the too many dice and too much number crunching. The story was gone, and ran into Trophy on Kickstarter, and it kind of belly flopped into it. So I'm playing in Jason's weekly session with Drew for Trophy Gold, and then I've written 2 dark incursions, Pick Me and Butter Princess, with a lot of help from Michael. And I submitted a thing to the Trophy Gold contest, but I had not played Trophy Gold when I submitted it, and it was a rambling hot mess. And so I'm sorry y'all had to read that. I've been reworking it and splitting it into actually 3 incursions because it was just too much. I tried to do this rambling desert narrative where the treasure hunters arrive and find that the looting's already been going on, and they have to choose between factions. And so it was a lot more about working with NPCs and less about sort of a dungeon crawl style. And in playing it with friends, that there was like 1 combat role the entire thing, and we had a blast. But it's not in the folder because I felt like it was just, even in re-editing it, I feel like it's still too far gone, but I really wanted to tag along and kind of eavesdrop today, see what I can learn.
Fantastic, thank you. And let's go to James.
Everyone, I'm James Smith, and my pronouns are he and him. And I guess the way I got into Trophy and to writing Trophy was essentially, so I've always enjoyed sort of creative writing, but I'm also an academic by trade, by day job. So I've been institutionalized into enjoying style guides and structures and things to sort of channel my writing into. And for some reason, when I started actually writing things for tabletop role-playing game, and Trophy in particular, it just seems to tick a box for me. Like, I enjoy it. So basically, I started off with Trophy Gold, writing an incursion for the contest called The Source of True Purpura, which is about ink. And I'm currently working on another one, which I've shared with you here, called Cutting Words, that's about speech. And it's kind of my way of trying to combine court crawling and cult crawling into one incursion. And I guess I'm just trying to tighten it up now, because I kind of enjoy what I put in it, but I feel like it needs to be sort of tightened up a bit more. And basically the plot of Cutting Words is that treasure hunters find themselves in the Rose district of Amberay in a coffee house, where it's rumored that there's this inflammatory pamphlet called Cutting Words that's basically stoking up tensions in the city. And it's rumored that if you can get an interview with the editor-in-chief of Cutting Words, then you can kind of make your dreams come true, wealth, knowledge, whatever you need. But actually there's a sort of secret organization behind the pamphlet, and something else much more secret behind the secret organization.
Fantastic, thank you. And last but not least, Mike.
Hi, folks. My name is Mike Ferdinando. My pronouns are he, him. So I've been playing role-playing games for a long time. In fact, I just realized that it'll be about, I'll have been playing RPGs for literally 40 years later this spring. I started playing in the spring of 1981, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. And from the get-go, I've been like writing stuff, although basically none of it was for other people to look at. Fast forward back in like back about 2010-ish, I got very heavily into the Pathfinder community, and played a lot of Pathfinder for several years until I started feeling like I was getting sort of like buried under the bulk of the rules, and I realized that my play style was much more narrative focused, and I found that a lot of the like Dungeons and Dragons third edition OGL stuff, I was regularly fighting the rules. They weren't really, they were kind of, I was finding the rules were getting in the way, and I was regularly like hand waving stuff and ignoring stuff and like overruling die rolls, even ones that the players rolled like, oh, you rolled a 2. No, you didn't, you hit. Just because I realized that, that the game I was playing wasn't really the rules of the game I was playing wasn't really providing the experience that I was looking for. And then I fell into Dungeon World, and Powered by the Apocalypse just kind of broke my brain in a good way. I started playing with a Gauntlet back in 2018, I think. It's been about 2 years. And have since then just really kind of jumped in both with both feet in the deep of the indie game and story game pool. And have been really enjoying that. And I was subscribing to Codex when Trophy Dark was first published. In fact, I think that might have been my first issue of Codex that I got. And I just thought it was really, really phenomenal. So I've played a fair amount of, not nearly as much as some of the people that are on this call, but I played a fair amount of Trophy, more Dark than Gold. I've never actually played Gold, although I've GM'd it several times. I submitted an incursion for the Gold design contest last year. Mine was Harpy's Maw, which was the nautical/pirate themed one. The one I have submitted here today was kind of like going back. I mentioned my experience with Pathfinder. So the incursion I submitted today was it's a conversion of a Pathfinder module. So the one I submitted was called the God's Mouth Heresy. I can't claim authorship of it. That one, the original module, is written by Paizo designer Rob McCreary, and it's a pretty good module. I know Jason and on Fear of the Black Dragon has talked about converting OSR modules for Trophy. I thought I'd take a stab at converting a modern traditional adventure for Trophy, and just to see how that works. Because modern traditional games definitely have a very different look and feel than OSR. And I found it was actually quite a lot harder to do the conversion than it was than converting an OSR. I would not attempt to convert a Pathfinder module on the fly like you can do it for like you can for an OSR module. So so the God's Mouth Heresy, again, it's a conversion of a Pathfinder module. In this, the treasure hunters have been hired by a cult who manage. They're a cult of they're the cult of a god. It's a god of death, but it's not an evil god of death. It's a god of it's the cult of the god who shepherds the dead into the afterlife. Which I've just stolen whole hog from the Pathfinder campaign world. It's one of the core deities from the Pathfinder game. But yeah, it's a goddess of death who is not evil, and it's a goddess of death who hates the undead. They believe undeath is like the ultimate heresy. And in adventure, the cult runs an ossuary in the city, and someone has been stealing corpses from the ossuary. And this is a huge scandal. So they want to hire a bunch of nobodies that nobody knows about to try to go in there and figure out what's going on. And again, I didn't write this plot, but this is a conversion, and I was just it's here as it is. So yeah, this is my exercise in attempting to convert a Pathfinder module that was published in 2011 for Trophy. So that was my design goal.
Fabulous, thank you. I think I got everybody. Make sure. Yep. Okay. So the way this is going to go, this workshop is going to be about trophy gold incursions. Not necessarily like we might do future workshops where we talk about like hacks of trophy gold, but for this one, we're going to be focusing on kind of the core trophy gold experience, in particular incursions. The way I'm going to basically moderate the discussion is we're going to do about 30 minutes on like the introduction material and the theme and the diagram. I think what I would like to do for all of these little segments is just ask Jesse and Gabriel to kind of share a few thoughts on that part of the incursion writing process, and then just basically turn it over to questions from you guys. When you do ask a question, you don't have to, but if you do have like a really specific question about your incursion, if you could just like give us like a flag of like, oh, it's on page 3 of In Memorial or whatever, that would be helpful. But your question can be more general too. That's perfectly fine. I'm going to be mostly moderating. I'll offer my thoughts here and there as needed, but there are like a million other places you can hear me talking about this stuff. So I'm going to let Jesse and Gabriel kind of take point on this one. And then after we're done with sort of the overview stuff, the introduction part of the incursion, we'll take a break, we'll come back, and then basically the bulk of the rest of the workshop is going to be about sets. We're going to deal with sets at a fairly high level. I think there might be future workshops where we talk about, say, monsters or set goals or like other discrete issues, but I want to just kind of keep it sort of general, I think, for today, as far as like constructing sets and things like that go. And then if we have time, we'll talk about like incursion, like the conclusions of the incursion. That's like a pretty easy part of the thing to write. So I don't think we have to focus on that too much. So with all that said, I'm gonna just open it up to Jesse and Gabriel first, just to like get your, just some thoughts, Jesse, about like the introduction of the incursion. What's the purpose of it? What are you kind of trying to aim for when you're writing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for me, there's a couple different ways that you can go about like just introducing the table to what they're about to enter into. Obviously, like the sort of classic trophy approach is some sort of poem or some other sort of like tone setting piece. That's something well worth considering. We haven't done as much of that in Gold, but I still think it makes sense to do just as a tone piece, right? A lot of introductions that I've seen or that we've been working on have sort of the two-part structure of like what do the players know, and then what generally like should the GM know as offering up for surprises or other things later on. And I think there's value in coming up with a short, succinct, like almost elevator pitch, short paragraph version that could essentially function as box text to get people into it. I noticed that there were a few incursions that were provided here that have like very long and elaborate descriptions, and that might be too much. Like it's hard to know as the GM, like, should I be reading all of this out loud? Am I just monologuing forever then? So think about having just like a nice, short, punchy introduction, kind of what Jason was saying, like, here's why you're here. This is what you're doing. Major kind of themes beyond just the core theme itself. So those are the places where I would kind of focus, is like, how do you get it down to a short bite-size elevator pitch for the introduction? Awesome. Gabriel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I was going to say something similar. Like as a reader, when I'm as a GM looking at a new incursion, at least personally, I have a kind of short attention span, and I get lost really quick if I'm looking at a full page. Then like I'm going to forget this by the time I get it to the table. I try to have a couple things that are just going to stand out and just be super evocative and strange and like, whoa, I want to go explore that. Like, what is that about? It might be something different, but in like the Loom tables, the way we have those like mini tables of questions after the intro paragraph, I love seeing a couple of things like that kind of give those layers of, rumors and myth about this place. So you can kind of throw some hints there from the start without having to like sketch out the full, history and true history or anything. Just here are some things that would pull your characters into this place. That if you read that paragraph at the start, it would be like exciting and draw everyone in.
Yeah, that's a really good
for.
That's a really good point. Those like I don't know that I've seen any of them here, but we do a lot. If you think of kind of the monster generator tables where you have 2 columns of D6s and it's like blah blah blah, pick from the list, blah blah blah, pick from another list to set it up. Those kind of hooks I think are really helpful. Hooks or rumors or other things that like kind of draw the characters in. I'm assuming that because these are gold incursions, these are going to be connected to a larger campaign, but even still having that sort of like segue or reason why the treasure hunters are here, I think is really important.
If I could just add real quick. So I just published an incursion of my own called Temple of the Peerless Star in Codex. And the beginning of that one, I included what I call establishing questions, which are essentially questions that you pose to the players in order to sort of get them hooked into the concept of the adventure. Because most likely when a GM picks the incursion to run it for their group, the group doesn't have a choice. They're definitely doing that incursion, right? There's no like, do you guys want to do this? No, they're definitely doing it, right? And so if you go, I'm happy to share it after the call, but like if you go and look at like that incursion that I wrote, those questions are all designed to sort of get player buy-in into the adventure, right? So it's like, you know, tell me about something that happened to you as a kid that's connected to X, or tell me about your, you know, tell me about your religious beliefs that are connected to this part of the incursion or whatever, right? Like just to sort of get them hooked in, because I think that's a good major, that's a major function of the introduction, is like to get the players bought into the premise of the incursion. Jesse and Gabriel, can we talk about theme real quick before we go to the questions? Like, what's your thought on like the theme portion?
Yeah. So I know there's been a little bit of development within the Discord on like how themes should be used or how much there should be for the theme. I'm still like a purist and like the kind of one word thing. But that's for my own like ability just to like try to focus and make sure I'm not spreading myself too thin on what the theme is. I think sort of describing the theme is also helpful. Like if you need to elaborate or connect it to certain moments or events that might happen later on in the incursion, I think that's fine. I think most importantly, it's like what is going to give the GM who's reading it the information they need to keep going back to, right? And how can you give yourself the focus you need to think like, am I time this thing that I want to write? Does it connect to the theme or not? And if not, then maybe I should ditch it and go somewhere else. So it's really about like focus and clarity in my mind.
Yeah, that's great. Gabriel, theme?
Yeah, it's also a fun place to, at least in the few incursions I've written, like to put clues or hints for how to weave that into the story. Because that's the joy of writing these, you know, incursions, where you can litter all these sets with all these little things and moments and details that are going to reflect that theme. But even a little note when you're discussing theme for kind of why that's the theme and ways the GM might weave that in or bring it out, how the characters might interact with it, how it might affect the environment. It's just helpful to have a couple notes to kind of put that seed in the GM's mind, so when they read those other moments and see those details later on, you know, kind of bring that to mind again.
Yeah, I'll tell you, as someone who runs a lot of Trophy Gold, and I do run a lot of Trophy Gold, you do frequently find yourself, because it's the nature of the game, you find yourself having to do a little bit of improv, especially after a risk roll and like a devil's bargain happens, and you have this great idea for this devil's bargain, but it's kind of on the GM to sort of like shape it and make sure it fits into the story, you know, in a way that makes sense. And I always go back to the theme when I'm like maybe stuck, or I just want like a little bit of like kickstart of like, okay, where do I go with this? Because the theme, like Jesse and Gabriel said, it has the intent, the goal for the user to me is to focus your thinking and to focus like to help create a coherent narrative, and it all just sort of hangs on that, right? I think a lot of like published adventures in other games do this, just not as explicitly as Trophy, right? Like I think every good dungeon has a theme, right? But Trophy like really hangs on it, and so yeah, so basically just like aid to the GM, I think is like a great thing there. I think I'm going to go to questions now, and anyone is welcome to like chime in and answer a question too, by the way. It's not just Jesse or Gabriel or myself. If you have a thought, like just say so. But basically, if you'll just kind of give me like a visual indication that you want to say something, I'll do my best to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Ryan, since we don't have you on video, just like say in the chat if you have a question, and I'll call on you. So yeah, questions about, if we keep our questions focused on the introduction and the theme, that would be great. Yeah, Michael.
So theme is something that I've kind of struggled with as a creator once I got past some of my initial experimentations, in that I find that sometimes what is being labeled in these as theme is actually maybe more of a motif, and it gets used visually. And so you may end up having parallel structures. And so I sometimes struggle trying to get it down to the purist's one topic. For example, in the Alluring, right? I sat for a long time wondering, is my theme crab? And I hated that idea. Like, there's a lot of crabs. If people are improvising, I hope it's gonna include crabs because there's crabs. But I also think that it's about plundering, right? If we're thinking about an actual narrative theme, meaning what is the focus that you're putting on the players as they're going through the incursion, I want them to be thinking of disease, because they're in a place where a lot of people have been sick and have died. I want them to think about infection. I want them to think about the desperation that is key to Trophy Gold that's driving them there. I end up with like a handful of things where I'm like, these are themes I'm keeping in mind as I'm creating sets and trying to craft the narrative they're moving through. Where do I go back and pick that word? So over time, I've been kind of becoming dissatisfied with the idea of picking out a single theme. I know it's great for making the quick pitch to a GM of here's generally what you're doing, and I completely get the lodestar thing, but yeah, any thoughts about how you trim that back down? Is it theme or is it motif? If it's motif, maybe it's a little easier because then you can just think, riff on this thing, right?
I'll confess to conflating them. I conflate theme and motif like pretty strongly, maybe like even intentionally. You know, Colin, you have something to say?
Well, I also kind of wanted to throw out, Gabe had mentioned he kind of uses it as almost a framework as he's adding new ideas and things in on the theme. And, he says, okay, does this fit with the theme that I'm going from? But I was also wondering if anyone has ever like not started with a theme and then gone through it and then discovered, I thought this was my theme, but this is actually what my theme was, because that almost sounds like the tension you're doing right there. So I was just kind of curious if anyone had done the opposite as well, rather than start with a theme and use that to think through things as you add them, go the opposite direction. Like, I wrote this thing and then look, what is the theme of this thing? What keeps coming out again and again, and then honing from that direction. Just was curious if anyone had done that as well, because it sounds like what you're kind of struggling with a little bit there, Michael.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid approach, and probably should happen in the creative process, right? Like, you're going to discover new things as you write and explore. And I think that that's totally fine to say, like, here's what I think this is all about, but on re-examination, like, it does really seem to be more about this instead. I think that that's totally fine. I haven't had that experience, but Gabe, do you want to chime in?
That's actually exactly what happened to me with this one. I had this idea of like, I wanted the reverse incursion, right? I wanted them to put something back, right? Replace something that's been stolen instead of stealing it themselves. But I didn't really know what the theme was, so I just wrote a bunch of stuff. And when I got to the last set and started writing these ghosts in, and like this idea of like helping other people's unfinished business, I then went back and found all these townspeople who also had unfinished business. And so I still don't have a name, but like it's starting to emerge, because I found stuff towards the end of the first draft that was way more interesting than where I started. Yeah,
that's definitely how it's worked for me too. Like, I bounce all over the place. If I get stuck on one part of writing something, I'll go write something else. And I don't think I've ever had the theme right away. I've struggled quite a bit with it too, until like towards the end, it feels right, where something fits the most. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I'll just reiterate too that like, I really think that, you can't go wrong as long as whatever you write in the theme part of your incursion is aimed toward helping the GM run the incursion, right? Like that just is really like the number one like priority, you know. Matt?
So one thing that sort of struck me, especially with what we had written, was whether there's a separation between the theme that's presented to the players and the theme that's presented to the GM. Because one of the things that we had sort of bounced back and forth doing was trying to hide sort of the time loop for a part of the incursion from the players. And so if you go into the theme is like time, well, you're kind of showing your hand, right? So do you think there's a balance that can be struck, or is there a value in having like a forward-facing theme and then sort of a behind-the-scenes theme?
Go ahead, Colin.
I was just saying, it strikes me, especially with that time example, like if you actually have to say the theme, that strikes me as it's probably a weak theme, right? Like they should feel it, they should know it, they should see the things all around. But if you have to tell them at the beginning, by the way, the theme is time, I would say you haven't communicated it well in the incursion, but that's just kind of my gut on that. Like, yeah, it should be soaked with it, but you shouldn't have to say it.
I tell players the theme when I'm running Trophy Gold. I tell them mostly because like I think there's value in, because once play starts happening, you switch into these like real distinct like modes of play that are both, you're either in character or you're out of character. You know, it's necessary in Trophy. It's just what happens when the dice hit the table. And so I tend to err on the side of giving players lots of information about like what is going to be happening, even if it's stuff their character wouldn't know, just so that it helps them get in the sort of spirit of things. Now, if you do have a thing that like is supposed to be like a twist or whatever, I think what you do is I think the introduction part is probably more important in that regard. You make sure the keeper, or not keeper, that's my game. You make sure the GM knows like what's the secret stuff. Like this is the secret stuff. Don't read this to the players. This is the stuff only you know for now. But then you know, you have the stuff that you want the players to know. As far as the theme itself goes, I don't think you have to read the paragraph. You could just say the theme is time, you know, and then that's, you know, or whatever. But I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, Jesse, but I don't think the rules of Trophy Gold provide you direction about like what the GM actually tells the players, right? It's kind of up to the GM.
Yeah, it is up to the GM. I was going to say too, just a quick chime in, like this hobby is unique in that the players, the people who are involved in it, are both audience and creator, right? And so I think the more information that you give the players as a GM, the more they can inhabit both of those roles. And I think that is a worthwhile consideration, right? Like I think there are still places for secrets and surprises and twists, but generally, like if you're doing a game that is built around theme, making the players aware of the theme and knowing kind of what you're heading towards will help everyone like feed into that. It's that sort of writer's room approach, right?
Yeah, absolutely. James had a question about secret introductions, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. I do want to see if there's any more thoughts or questions about themes, since we're kind of on theme right now. Brian, go ahead.
Just a thing I noticed recently on the dark incursions that I've written. In dark, at least, the theme for me is proving to be what's the thing they want that they're not going to get. It's not the, like, you know, spooky bones is the theme or gold is the theme. It's, you know, it's what do you wish for your treasure hunter, and you are going to be denied that, and that is the theme. And that's working out pretty well for me. I'm trying to parse that into gold a little bit.
Theme is, I mean, I might be a little out of order here, but I think theme is more important in dark than it is in gold in general. Just because in dark the GM has so many fewer tools to make the story happen than in gold. Dark is so much more of a writer's room approach, so much more of a shared narrative authority between player and GM, that the theme is doing a huge amount of work in dark, right? That doesn't mean it doesn't have a role in gold, obviously, but yeah, it's in terms of like needs at the table, it's two different things, I think. But any other thoughts on theme or questions for that matter? All right, I'm going to get to James's question. James, you had a question about secret introductions, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. I guess my question is, so I mean, I know you, Jason, have used quite a lot of them, like in the Pillar Star and also in Hester's Mill. And I guess my question is, how much should they tell the GM? Because I feel like if you over-explain the contents of the incursion, you're actually kind of stifling the GM a bit. So I want to know like how much, because I feel like my current secret introduction doesn't really say enough, but I feel like I'm just at the verge of saying too much, if that makes sense, and being a boring doctrinaire like writer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, anybody has any thoughts? Jesse or Gabriel, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just rereading your secret introduction right now, so I can give you like pointed, useful feedback. So give me 1 second.
Okay, I'll yammer on for a bit. I think that I take a super utilitarian approach to the introductions, right? I mean, if you look at the ones I've published, you literally read the player part out loud, right? There's no like parsing anything, you know. I think for the GM part, the stuff that's secret to the GM, you can be a little bit more detailed and verbose, because that's not going to be read to the players. In that sense, I think it's okay to trust the GM to like take whatever they're going to take from it, you know, and process it how they're going to process it. Because to some degree, and I talk about this on Fear of the Black Dragon all the time, to some degree, what the dungeon or the incursion or the text is meant to do is just to get the GM into a headspace to get ready to run it. The details are not as important as just like, have I given you a nice survey of the land so that you can kind of react when you need to, right? But anyway, those are my thoughts while we're waiting on Jesse.
Yeah, it's like signposting, right? You're saying like, these are the things to pay attention to as you read the rest of this incursion. And I think that's really the value that they provide. I think looking specifically at yours, I think you do a good job of that, actually, like just outlining, you know, here's who's actually like running this, the pamphlet, like here's kind of generally what's about to happen. And I think it's okay. Like, it's really just like, what do the players know and what do you need to know to be a successful GM as you run it?
Thinking too, another thought is that you can let the props and the traps tell that story too, with all the sort of like visible details and then details they'll discover on a hunt roll. I mean, because those are facts that you're laying out too. So those become secrets that the players discover at that point too. So you can spread it out in a lot of different ways without having to worry about the introduction as much, maybe.
I think that's exactly right. Alicia,
I guess
sorry.
That was my problem. Is I was just worried I was just at the point of over-explaining in at the beginning, when I think it's good to be able to spread it out like that across the incursion.
Yeah, absolutely. Alicia?
Yeah, that's, I struggled a little bit at first, I think, and I may be still struggling with my introduction in general and my little secret introduction. It's quite short. I maybe had the opposite problem of a lot of people and didn't put enough information in. And a little bit, I think this is maybe sort of this Brindlewood Bay mindset I have, where I'm actually like, I don't know, the players are going to figure out. The players are just going to tell me, and that's going to be the answer. So my approach in my secret thing was to be like, here's some guidelines. Here's some things that like could happen, could be the cause. Take them or leave them. And I can't decide if I'm committed to that approach or if it's actually terrible.
I do think there has to be, especially in the I keep saying keeper, especially in the GM portion. In the GM portion, I think there does have to be a certain degree of defined truth in there. That just feels important to me. Like if like I feel like anything you put in that part of the introduction or that part of the incursion, that's got to be like the true thing. And kind of going back to what James was worried about, like over explaining and kind of being too doctrinaire or pinning yourself in. Obviously you want to avoid that, but like I do think there's something to be said about like, okay, here's the true thing. You know, like if nothing else, this is the thing that we know to be true, right? I think there's a sort of like understanding especially once you start running a lot of Trophy Gold, you get to this understanding of, yeah, there's all this true stuff, but the devil's bargains are going to like throw all that stuff out the window in fairly short order. But at least you gave the GM a foundation on which to kind of like start, you know, which I think is helpful. So.
And a place to go back to, right? To the point of theme, right? It's a way for you to then say like, well, if devil's bargains are on the table, for you to propose things that might tie it back to that original idea. I actually think what you have here is is fine as well in terms of your secrets. The bigger question is like, do we need secrets generally? Like, does that sort of presuppose a sort of mystery template that maybe isn't necessary for an incursion?
Probably depends on the incursion.
Yeah.
Some degree. I like what you said about, as the GM, you could use your devil's bargains offer to bring it back to the incursion. And I do that all the time. I'll be like, how about this? And it's like just the thing that's written in the incursion. We've got like maybe like 5 or 6 more minutes to spend on introduction and theme. Diagram too. I don't know how much we have to say about the diagram. I think the rules of Trophy Gold and the various things we put out there about creating incursions probably covers it pretty well. But Jesse, I do want to get your thoughts just on why are we doing it that way? What's the purpose of the diagram being that the sort of standard flow chart? Not that you don't have to do it that way, but that's how most of them are.
I mean, for me, it was just a way to help. Like, I'm a visual person, and so not having a map there or something else, like having just some way to say these are roughly how things are kind of connected together, and to give the GM a sense of, it's that same idea of the introduction providing the lay of the land, right? Like, this should be a way for you to just kind of visually put things in boxes and know, like, okay, it could start here and kind of go to here or here, right? It narrows the field down a little bit without turning it into a railroad. So that's why I think the second set diagrams are useful for me. I'm totally open to hearing what other people think though as well.
Yeah, Michael?
With regards to the diagrams, I actually at one point was playing around with stealing a mechanic I think I saw in Silent Titans, which is creating a little table of sort of what you can see from here to give the connective tissue between the sets. This is easier, of course, if your sets are divided geographically and are within line of sight. But it occurred to me that it wouldn't take a lot of tweaking to create a mechanic where you just set up where do you want the story to go and signpost it like that. I don't know, I'm like metaphorically thinking of walking up to one of those Looney Tunes style crossroad things with all the arrows pointing off, and you can just say, you've completed this set. Do you now want to explore Big Spooky Place? Or do you want to go south to talk to Charming Lady maybe? And just like, if the writer provides broad strokes of here's what's in the next thing, so you can preview it and decide which one you want to go to, would that be of value to a GM in addition to just the map? Or do we just trust that the GM is going to read them all and they're going to have an idea as to where they want to steer players in case it's not clear which direction they should be going in next?
I think that's a cool idea. I like that idea of like, go here or go here. Yeah. I mean, essentially, like that's what I do as a GM anyway, is like, especially if there's a branching path, it's like, you can see this or you can see this.
I think it's worth pointing out too that the flowchart method of doing the diagram, which is what you mostly see in the published incursions, is not the only way it has to be. I mean, it can be a map. Like, you can, if you want to draw a map, draw a map. You know, if you want to put a map in there, do that. As long as you as the GM, or as long as the reader, the GM who's eventually going to use it, as long as they know where the set goals lie and like where the set's divisions are, I think it's okay. But I think it's just worth pointing out, because I think that a lot of people think that the flow chart is the way you have to do it, but it's actually not the case. You can, much like the introduction, you can do whatever serves your incursion best. So. Any other thoughts on diagrams or really anything, especially if anybody hasn't had a chance to ask a question or speak up or anything? If you have anything you want to say, by all means. Colin, go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, just a kind of question on that visual. I noticed that a lot of people used that kind of real boxy kind of presentation. Like, I know I just haven't seen a ton of the published stuff yet. Is that kind of the standard as well? Like, where you've got the kind of rows of the like the set, then the traps.
Yes.
And that's kind of the standard way
that is the standard
visually doing it. Okay.
Yeah.
I just saw that on some and didn't see it on others, and wasn't sure if that's just kind of what people are used to at this point.
Oh yeah, like I think when people are writing them, because the guidance we provided for the contest was you would do it. Oh, did we lose Colin? So we lost Colin.
No, Colin's
still here.
Oh, you just switched boxes. Sorry. Like, where'd you go?
You're kicking me out already.
Yeah, I know. You're down in the like the guest part of Hollywood Squares, the person they don't care about. Okay, I think that like like, I've already lost my train of thought. Jesus Christ. That like totally threw me. What was I going to say?
Traps, treasures.
Oh yeah. So when we wrote the contest guidelines, we asked for people to put it as like bullet points. And also whenever I do like, when people like turn in pitches, that's usually how I like it. If something if it's something I'm gonna publish because the layout person will do the charts, but the end product is the chart tables, like one row of props, the connecting traps and treasures and so forth. So but the diagram does not have to be the flow chart though. That's just what that's what's sort of developed as the common thing people do. Any other?
I think Ryan had a comment and Mike raised his hand.
Yep. Oh, thanks, Ryan, or thanks, Jesse. Ryan, go for it.
One thing I wanted to say about the introductions with the signposts is that reading these and not having read a lot of incursions prior, it was delightful to see the signposts and then get into the sets and seeing like how you got from signpost to signpost. And some of the introductions I thought had this like sort of I don't know, like you give the signpost, and as you start going through the sets, you as the GM can sort of get that sense of discovery that you're going to be trying to bring to life with the game. And I think especially with some of those like secret introductions, saving a couple notes of discovery, like figuring out what the editor-in-chief actually was, when we kind of got to that set, like it helps the journey sort of play out. And I really liked reading those.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. Awesome.
I think Mike had a comment or a question.
Yeah, Mike, go for it.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to toss in. I really like the flowcharts as a visual guide. Part of it is part of my day job is I write a lot of often very complex flowcharts. A big part of my job is like business process analysis. So I think in flowcharts, and having them there is I just find it very, very helpful. Another thing that I like about the flowchart is sort of like a meta comment about like Trophy's design. And I think this has come up in one of the podcasts I listened, that Trophy is looking at like a Trophy incursion is sort of like a deconstruction of a standard dungeon crawl. And seeing the flowchart in place of the map, I think is just another. I just find it very, very useful. Like you're not moving from like room 1 to room. You're not moving from on the map. You're not moving from like encounter area 14 to through this door that connects to encounter area 17. Whereas everything is much more abstracted, but the flowchart is there to provide at least a certain amount of guidance on how you're moving from like one set of areas to another set of areas to another set of areas. I just find it very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's a really terrific point. I'll just say this quick thing before we go on break. To your point about like the abstraction idea, this is something I've talked about a lot on the Trophy podcast. It's this idea that, because unlike in say a more traditional role-playing game like D&D or something like that, in Trophy, there's going to be the dice rolls, especially the risk roll, is going to really, really upend everyone's expectations, especially the GM's expectations about like what is happening in the dungeon. And so you have to have some space to play, right? And so my favorite example is if I describe the chamber that they're walking into as a 10-foot by 10-foot cube, I'm totally limiting like what people can do on the devil's bargain. Whereas if I say it's a small space, it creates a little more gray area for people to say things. If I say the ceiling is 30 feet high, like, okay, that's maybe helpful, but it's maybe a little better to say it's a very large chamber. That way, in a future die roll, someone can kind of like, basically like if I don't define things too precisely, I leave space for the players to like come up with cool things on the risk roll negotiation, right? And I think that's a really important part of Trophy. And I think the diagram is kind of part of that. You can draw a map. A map can be limiting, right? And I think that's it. There's a balance there, right? Like how, kind of going to what James was also asking about earlier, like in terms of the introduction and the keeper introduction, you don't want to limit yourself too much, right? And I think it's especially important in geographic space, right? So, all right, so anything else before we go on break? Any last little bits? Okay, we're gonna take a 5-minute break. When we come back, we're gonna start diving into sets. I think the emphasis on the conversation is probably gonna be set goals, if I had to guess, but we'll kind of try to take every little piece of it as best we can. And yeah, so let's take 5. Okay, we're back. So sets, Jesse, I think the best way to start here is if you would tell us maybe from a design standpoint what your goals were in making the game this way, because it is so different from a traditional dungeon. Like, what was the purpose of this structure?
Yeah. So sets to me, just like as a broad thing, goes back to the idea of like a stage, right? The set itself is like a stage that you set with props and all of these other elements, right? So I try to think about them as like visually, where is the action happening at the moment? And we have since sort of adapted that and modified that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a single room, right? But the idea is that it's a sort of flexible, amorphous space that is filled with a variety of elements for the players to interact with, or the treasure hunters more specifically to interact with. And those are the props. And then at a deeper level, I wanted to make sure that each set had one very explicit goal, so that it was clear what the characters should be doing in that location. And whether that is very explicitly signposted or not, the important thing is that the players generally know what the treasure hunter should be doing in that spot. So the goal is really like the most important element of the set. And then beyond that, making sure that you have your list of props and all of the elements that can be interacted with, and then traps and treasures, as well as additional traps and treasures, so that it's so that there's enough info there for the GM to be able to figure out, like, as things modify and are changed because of the result of devil's bargains, that there are things to like pick and grab at and propose to the players for them to be able to find or encounter, right? 5 times out of 6, generally, they're going to run into something terrible. And so having a list of options there as they're exploring, I think, is super helpful. And just visually for me, I wanted to make sure that there was like a very clear grid structure where you could just read across a horizontal band and be able to see, like, these are all the things that I need to be thinking about right now in this with this specific prop.
That's awesome. Thanks. Gabriel, when you like are writing an incursion, how do you approach the sets? Like, what are you thinking about when you're like approaching it? Like, what's kind of going on in your process there?
I guess it's pretty organic. Like I said earlier, I kind of will write a little bit till I get stuck or don't really know where it's going. I'll go to another area and keep bouncing around. So I feel like as I've built the sets, they've informed each other a lot. So like for Leviathan's Bridge, I don't really know. It was a weird series of ideas and just imagery I really loved and wanted to fit together. And so as I had a few set goals that didn't quite work, that I had to change later on. But the more I kind of kept moving around and thinking about how they were connected, how the characters were going to move through them, that started to have each set inform itself a little bit more. That's all I can think of right now.
I think one of the things that made Leviathan's Bridge so successful, it was the contest winner last year. I think what made it so successful, from my read, one of several things, but one of the things that made it so successful is you used every part of the incursion, every part of the set to tell the story of that incursion. That's something that Harpy's Maw that Mike did was really good at that as well. And so my note here for sets, in terms of writing them, I think there's a whole separate thing about like maybe use cases or whatever, a separate thing to say there. But in terms of like what's in them, I think that like it's using every part of the set is like there's an opportunity to tell the story of the place, right? It doesn't have to be like super detailed. It doesn't have to be like, you know, tons of exposition, but by having some additional equipment and having some or additional treasure and additional traps, by peppering traps and treasures in, by showing the different props, but moments, I mean, moments are huge, right? It's all an opportunity to tell the story of the place and to do it in a way that's a little more efficient than a traditional dungeon where it is indeed just big blocks of paragraphs, right? So yeah, sets are cool. I mean, maybe we could like swing over into the just kind of going through each part of it. The overview portion, I think we have set name, set goal. We could start with set goal, actually. So Jesse, I know that set goal is one of those things where I feel like it's probably maybe developed differently than maybe you originally intended when you first came up with the idea of set goals, but I want to just get your like original like thinking on set goals.
Yeah. I mean, it's part of that sort of, well, so the original thinking was, for me as the GM, what do I want the treasure hunters to be doing in this spot? Like, what is the goal, right? Like explicitly, like what is the goal of this set? Like, why is it even here? Why is this set here? What's the value of including it? So that it's not just like a 10-foot by 50-foot dungeon corridor or something, right? That you just walk through. Like it needs to have a purpose. And so the original purpose for the goal was to just say like, this is why it exists. This is what is happening here. And as we've pushed more into that kind of like writer's room style with this, that goal has become very explicit, or much more explicit, in terms of just saying like, here's why you're here. This is what you're doing. Yeah, so Colin just asked, when you're GMing, do you tell them what the goal is for each set? Yes, and I think you can do that either in character or not, right? Because I think it's fine to just say like, the reason you're here is to do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. Or if you have some sort of a proxy character who can feed that information, or a way to do it sort of in the context of the game diegetically, right? That you can do that. So, but yes, you should tell them that. That's an important piece of this.
It has a powerful impact on play.
Yeah.
When you tell players the set goal, it completely I can't stress enough like the way it shapes play at the table. I mean, it is so I don't want to go into it too much, but basically kind of what you're doing with the set goal, you are telling the players, here's what you're meant to be doing, here's what your characters are meant to be doing, right? And you're also sort of priming them for the kind of tone and experience they can expect to have, right? And I think that's really, really important in terms of like telling them versus not telling them. If you don't tell them, honestly, the rest of it kind of falls apart, because like, what are the point of the props and what are the point of all these like details if they don't know what
like, why am I even here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to that like in character versus out of character thing. Players are 100% capable of separating in character and out of character information. I see it every week, and it's totally doable. So, Gabriel, what are your thoughts on set goals?
Set goals, I think this is one of those things that just blew my mind when I came across Trophy. I could see just exploring this alone for quite a long time with the variety of types of goals you could have and what that implies with like very, very few words. It's almost like the set is this other character. Like at one point, I think Jesse was in the Trophy Discord, you had those tables, those lists of different types of goals. And even playing with that is just amazing. You could have all the verbs alone. You're going here to steal something, to rescue something, to slay a monster, to complete a ritual. It could be so many different things. And then what part of the place you're supposed to interact with. I think for so many games, the assumption is, like Michael said earlier, we're here to go, beat up monsters and steal their treasure. But if it's something different already, it implies so much about the environment and the history of that place and the types of encounters you can have. So I really, really love it. And I think I'm going to be experimenting with it for quite a long time.
Gabe.
Yeah, for kind of with the GM hat on instead of like the writer hat, the goals help avoid the boring parts, right? Like how many like perception checks do we make rolling down this corridor, which takes 45 minutes of real time? Right? We just skip ahead to the next thing and we're doing the next thing that's interesting. And that's what's super fun. And that's where Jason, to your point, like telling explicitly just focuses all the players on the interesting things, but it doesn't constrain them because of devil's bargains and just the basic nature of the hunt roll and like all of these pieces and how there's all this stuff to discover that isn't written in the incursion. And so that's where like when I'm trying to write, sometimes it's actually harder than improvising on the fly. Like improvising on the fly, like I know where it's going. And so what I've tried to test, and it was nice to see other people write this into their drafts, was like, how do you write a set goal that isn't just get to the next physical location, right? And sometimes those are really important and really valid. And yet, how do you make a compelling goal that is something more than that?
I'd like to put on my dev editor hat for a minute and say that something that can help you when you're writing set goals is to think really hard about what your overall design goals are, right? So when I wrote Hester's Mill, one of my design goals for the incursion was that that twist of like, okay, there's the fake story, but then there's the real story, right? And the moment when they learn the real story is the big dramatic kind of, it's the hinge on which the rest of the incursion hangs. And so when I was writing my set goals, I was like, okay, because that's a major goal for me in this incursion, I want to make sure at least one of the set goals reflects this, right? Like, and so the set goal was learn the secret history of Hester's Mill, right? And I played it so many different times, and some groups immediately want to know, and so they pursue it and they like try to unlock that set goal right away because they want to know. Other groups like the mystery. They like letting it hang in the air. And even if they don't actively pursue the set goal, just the existence of the set goal creates a vibe at the table and creates a certain type of experience, right? And so that's another important thing to keep in mind is like from a high design level, design goal standpoint, like how can your set goals reflect that?
It's a way to like highlight things that might be coming in later on, right? So you can put out meet the monster in the lake or whatever, like, and then, oh, there's a monster, there's a lake, like it gives them like things to start progressing towards, and things that they would likely discover anyways, but helps point everyone in the same direction. One thing that I've said a lot is that if you haven't played Lady Blackbird or read it or looked at it, you should do that, because what it does is in the very beginning, it outlines, here is the direction everyone is headed, and it sort of guides play in that direction. It says like, here's the mission that you're all on, and this is what you're doing. And so having a set goal that does that, or that's basically the purpose of a set goal, right? It helps get everyone on the same page so that they're headed in the same direction.
Any other comments or questions about set goals? Matt, go for it.
So one thing that actually sort of underlines the importance of them is that I will say we really struggled to put together a memorial with the locations that were from the set goals, because how do you provide that direction when the characters have like a giant sandbox and they're in the sort of wandering around the same places over and over again? And we debated back and forth sort of whether to structure the set goals in a traditional way. And I'm not sure that we came up with the right balance. And I was wondering if you had like any thoughts or advice on how to do something like set goals when you have repeating locations.
I do have some thoughts here. I don't want to keep talking all the time, but like I actually just ran the Death Ziggurat, which is a Morkborg dungeon, and it's a hex crawl. It's a small hex crawl, but it's a hex crawl, and the characters are going back and forth to various locations all the time, right? And so what I did was I abstracted like you do in Trophy, right? Like I made the hexes a little bit bigger, or the areas a little bigger than the hexes would have them be, right? But basically, I made sure my set goals, because I knew going back and forth was going to be a thing, I made sure that none of the set goals were about navigating the space. That's really important. Like if the set goals are about navigating the space, that's not a good fit where like easy navigation between the space is assumed, right? And so I made the set goals more about story beats and narrative beats. Like now, this was a conversion, so I already knew what those beats were, right? So I could kind of go back and like, pull it apart. But basically it's like, okay, here's an important thing they need to know in the story. I think they're going to learn that over here. So here's the set goal for this, right? And so basically, as they were able to move in and out of the various sets across the various parts of the hex crawl as they needed to, and whether they solved the set goal or not, and when they were ready to know the answer to the set goal, or they were ready to like accomplish that particular story beat, then they could engage the mechanics in the way they needed to make it happen. But I think importantly, when it comes to navigating like a hex crawl, or where navigating between spaces is happening pretty much freely, the set goals should not focus on navigating the space. That's my thought anyway. I don't think else has anything to add on that, but
I think Gabriel, do you want to share your thought too that you just shared in the chat?
Oh, just an idea that came to mind was, what if the set goal changed slightly when you visited that set again? Whether it's so that alone could signal, how different things are. Or you've been here before, but something's different. Change a word or two, or a completely different goal.
Yeah,
I've done multiple goals. Yeah.
I think the question worth asking is like, why are they going back there? And with a time loop, there's an obvious answer, but if there's another reason to go back, then you can highlight that as like a sequential set goal. And something Gabriel and I had been working on another project is just having a list of multiple set goals. So I think that's totally valid as well.
I want to go to, I know Gabe and Alicia had questions from earlier. They had their hands up at least. Gabe, do you still have a question?
Yeah, mine was about the specificity of writing. So I think Jesse just gave the example of like meet the monster at the lake. And then sometimes I see a goal that's like way more explicit, that like names the NPC, right? And it's this like, it's kind of that secret question, right? Are we going to hold back like, oh, there's a monster versus meet the dragon at the lake, right? Or meet the named dragon at the lake. Like how do folks think about that?
I think it depends. So to be clear, my example was just a bad off the cuff one. So don't feel free to use that as like rote. But yeah, I think it depends on what your goal is with why they're going to that set in the first place. And feel free to give out as much or as little information as makes sense. If they already know about the dragon and it already has a name, then feel free to include that, right? If it makes sense.
I ran, I had an incursion, or a conversion that I ran the other day, and I had one of the set goals be learn how to please the blood god. Up to this point, they'd never heard of the blood god. They didn't even know there was a blood god. They had no idea about any of this, but just naming the set goal like having that be the set goal totally set the tone of the table, right? Like suddenly everybody's like, oh, there's something going on here, and it has to do with the blood god, right? I like the way that set goals in a meta sense can almost act as like plot twists, right? Like they can really like kind of be a plot twist sort of device at a meta level, which I think is totally in the spirit of Trophy. So yeah, it's just another little thing to throw in there. So kind of decide on what kind of impact you want to have, right? So I think I named Malfast straight away when you first like get to that part of Hester's Mill. It's like, oh yeah, there's a demon called Malfast. He's invisible. He's definitely here. Like there's no hiding it, right? And it's because I want that like punch, So. Alicia, what's your question?
So my incursion is not done, but I found the set goals really interesting in helping me to plan out actually the entire story, and thusly my set goals are highly linked to the narrative of my incursion, and maybe a little less so to each particular set. And I'm not sure if it's going to stay that way. Like I might try to drill down a little bit more specificity, but because my incursion is actually a lot about discovery, learning, like, just finding out what's going on. It's like you go here and you learn about this, which leads you to the next place. It's a little linear, but and so I'm just wondering like how people feel about this sort of like set goals as the narrative of your story. Like if you read my set goals, you'll find out what's happening by the time you get to the end.
Yeah, does anyone have thoughts on that?
I think that's smart. I mean, I think that's a smart way to think about it, right? Because it essentially serves as an outline for the story that you're helping to guide the players and the GM through.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it goes back to design goals, like I said earlier. Like if you're, because the thing is even if the set goal is not about navigating the space or finding treasure or unlocking the door or whatever, the treasure hunters can still do all that stuff, right? You can still have all that stuff in your set, right? You can have a prop that's a trap or a puzzle or whatever. You can have like a prop that has a particular trap attached to it that's about navigating the space. Like you can put all that stuff in there. The set goal is a statement about what you want this to be about, right? Like it's a statement about, okay, yes, there's all the sort of typical dungeony things, but what we're really doing here, like Jesse and other people have said, is we are learning the story, say, or what have you, so that's perfectly legitimate. It all comes back to like what you kind of intend for that part of the dungeon to be. It's almost like a drilled down theme, right, in a way, in some sense. So it's almost like the overarching introduction and theme, but like in miniature, right? Like here's a little tiny version of it for this part. Colin?
I was just going to say to Alicia's question that obviously it's pretty early in your writing, but I think just having those set goals, I had a pretty clear idea of where you're going with this thing. And I'm like, man, I can't wait till she writes this thing. I was so excited seeing those like plot points, basically. I'm like, man, I can't wait to see her fill it in. So for me, it worked really well. And get writing on that thing. I'm excited about it.
Thank you. Yeah, it was honestly the only reason those are pre-written is because I was trying to figure out where the story was going, and I was like, well, I might as well do this with the set goals because I clearly got stuck and was like, where do I go next? But thank you.
I do think there's probably like a small thing just to be aware of. I wouldn't say it's a danger, but you never want to hem yourself in too much, right? I think it's really important when you're writing set goals that the completion or non-completion of one doesn't break the rest of it, right? Like that's really important, right? They need to be able to kind of coexist. Now, if they're linear, like this one leads to this one, you don't have to worry about that as much, right? But if they sort of go back and forth, if the space is easily navigable, you want to make sure that like the existence of one set goal and whether it's unlocked or not doesn't break the rest of them, right? They all need to coexist. I think that's important. James, you had a really interesting comment here about like the secret intro and how set goals affect that. You want to say that on the call?
I guess all I was saying was further to what we were talking about before. If you don't want to sort of belabor the point at the beginning, like you were saying, Jason, with the Malfast just sort of dropping right in there, which is said in the secret intro. I guess if you sort of telegraph like the secret sort of, it's like an interface between the GM facing secret intro and the player knowledge, and it's that sort of magic of like it being a place where the two meet, but it also stops you having to be too verbose behind the scenes to the GM. I guess that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it's a great observation. Anything else about set goals? I mean, I think set goals is a huge topic and it's super important to Trophy Gold. I think it's something that like we should, as a group, we should continue discussing like on Discord and things. It's always a valuable discussion to have. But are there anything anybody wants to say or have a question about set goals? Colin, go ahead.
So I think someone had mentioned just early on that there were some just kind of example set goals, and I seem to remember some of those around, but I just was curious if that had just examples of different ways people approach it as something still available.
Yeah, I'll track that down and share it in the chat here. And then I don't know if this video is getting posted, but we'll make sure that it follows along with it.
Yeah, it is. We'll put it there. Yeah, absolutely. Anything else about set goals? Go ahead, Ryan.
So I wanted to ask a specific question about the incursion we wrote, if that's okay. And it'd be on page 7 of the Last Days of Kova, where we have our King's Chase set. And the goal of that set is to get somewhere else. And I'm really just sort of questioning whether, like, does the set sort of become extraneous if it's just about traveling through it? The comment you made about we sort of like assume movement between sets is relatively straightforward. Is there space for for journey goals, or is that sort of, yeah.
Matt, go ahead.
I would suggest reading Top of the World as
agree.
a fantastic example of movement as set goal.
Yeah, I think I know what you're asking, Ryan, and I actually think I agree with Matt. There's a lot of benefit here in looking at other incursions that have really focused on movement. One that I ran recently is From the Belly of the Beast by Madeline Ember. Fabulous incursion, really, really good. And the final set on that one is so interesting because it has the goal of get out of here alive, right? Like it's literally just get out of here alive. And as a result, there's not a lot of treasure, there's not a lot of traps, there's not a lot of like extra stuff in the set, you know. It's just kind of like a very bare bones set because it has a pretty immediate pressing set goal, right? And so I think matching the set goal to the set and the stuff you have in there, I think that probably needs to be, you know, kind of the case here. Like in yours, where it says quickly travel to another district in Kova, is that to say quickly get out of this set? Is that the idea there?
Yeah, I think we were thinking of it as sort of like a dangerous journey, right? And I'm not certain that anything would be communicated by that set goal, if that's the case.
I would probably recharacterize it just because you do have so much cool stuff here that can be interacted with. And I think you probably don't want to necessarily maybe rush away from it, right? Maybe you could recharacterize the set goal as find a way to get to another district in there. Ty, go ahead.
That's exactly what I was going to say too, because like you have the horses, you have like there are options there, and so I think figuring out the best option or the route is the way to go.
Yeah, that way the set goal, even if they spend the 3 tokens right away, you just tell them how to get out, but then they still have to do it, you know. So that way they interact with it a little bit more. Ty, go ahead.
Yeah, sort of just a follow up on that is, do you think there's any sort of worth to essentially sort of resetting the set goal? Because specifically for that set, we kind of expect the players to come back multiple times. So would resetting it and saying you need to, you know, spend tokens again, possibly, or find another way, and in order to like sort of extend that set a bit, since it is such like a hub sort of set that you're coming back to multiple times?
I think that's cool. It seems like an interesting option to me. It promotes exploration, right? And having them engage with multiple sets of props. So I think that could be a cool route to go with it. What would be the trigger? Just like going back to it, that it would reset? Or
I think that with 4 separate ways to leave, maybe every time you try to get to a different exit would be resetting it. So if you came back and tried to go to a different set than you were already at, you'd have to sort of solve the set again, is sort of what I was thinking.
As long as it doesn't get too like boring or heavy-handed, right? Then I think it's interesting.
Gabriel, I'd love for you to chime in because so I don't know if you all know this or not, but Gabriel wrote so we're publishing this thing called Roots of Old Caldur, which is like this mega dungeon for Trophy Gold, which was unlocked during the Kickstarter campaign. And Gabriel wrote all the connective sets, so going down, going across, like they sort of connect up all the littler sets, right? And so. And what they are is essentially hub sets, like you've described, Ty. So maybe, Gabriel, if you have any thoughts on how you handled that, that'd be great.
Yeah, thinking back on those, I mean, I just tried to pack a lot of different options for the GM of what you could encounter so that it wouldn't be boring. Again, using those 2 little like D6 tables. And then what else did I have in there? I was thinking something else that going back to our discussion of like what's visible from a set could be interesting for like, you know, giving that visual to the players. Like if the set goal is to travel to this other one, you have to traverse this dangerous bridge, or like one of the sets, like Jason mentioned, is like, I think we just call it like the climb. That's a vertical climb if you're going from up or down to a deeper layer of the mega dungeon. So you already know that the journey is dangerous. You're going to encounter hazards. There's different ways you could approach it. So maybe just giving more variety for what the GM could throw in there at you. And also just another thing that I plan to experiment on is like changing sets. I've seen people discuss like almost like legacy board games where if you've the area you've traveled into or completed a set changes that place, you come back later and there's a new set goal. I think that could be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's probably just really important that if you do go with this like hub set concept that like basically has the same goal every time, I just think it's probably really important that there just be lots of stuff to interact with there, right? If you intend for them to like really engage it again, right? There's probably nothing to stop you from just having it be like a thing they come back to, but maybe they don't have to engage with a lot mechanically, you know, like you could probably do it that way. But if you want it to be kind of a challenge, if one of your goals is for that to be like a challenging thing they have to always kind of do, yeah, I think like just making sure there's lots of stuff there, you know, that you can kind of, so the GM feels supported, right? I think that's really important.
A variety of NPCs, if it's a city environment, you know, you could even just have a handful, and every time it's different variety of monsters.
Make them want to go back, you know?
Yeah.
Okay, so any other comments or questions about set goals? Why don't we talk about overview and moments together? I think that'd be great. I have a lot of thoughts on overview and moments that I've shared in a million places, but Jesse, let's get yours.
I mean, it's really just like setting the stage more than anything else. And the moment someone asked in chat, like, when do you offer up something terrible on when that comes up as an option on the hunt roll? And those moments are a good place to go back to. So just having good, like, nice, punchy, creepy or thematic items in that list, I think is super important. I think Jason has mentioned before, like those moments are your opportunities to like make whoever's running this game look like a rock star GM, because they can just drop those in super easily. So yeah, they're just super great ways to reinforce theme and just make sure they're short and punchy and evocative.
What about the overview? I feel like the overview gets like overlooked a lot when we talk about Trophy Gold.
Yeah. So Jason, do you usually just read that out loud? How do you do it?
I read it straight, yeah. And when I write them to be read directly to the players.
Yeah, I think that's the right approach.
I mean, it doesn't have to be that way, right? But like I like it that way, especially if I think it's even extra special good if in the overview you also point out the props, so the GM literally just has to read the overview, right? And then they go. But yeah,
more than anything else, make sure you're giving them a sense of all the different props so they know what they're interacting with.
What do we go do? Yeah, and even if like, now this is more of a GMing Trophy Gold thing, but sometimes the overviews don't include all the props. Mine don't. Like I don't usually put all the props in the overview, but the props should be things. Generally, they should be things that the GM can point out to the players to go interact with, right? But the overview is like your best opportunity to sort of like point the players in a direction, right? And you know, you got set goal, and then you got the overview. You've laid the table completely at that point, especially if you point out the props, and then you just react to dice rolls, right? That's kind of like the nice thing there. Gabriel, any thoughts about overview or moments?
I mean, I think the overview is super important with this more theater of the mind kind of game, both for the players and the GM. Even when I'm reading an incursion, I'll get stuck making sure I'm giving a good picture of what to look at. So it's a good way to just say like, oh, yeah, you're in a sprawling series of catacombs. And then within that, here's some other props. I also love playing with moments as ways to like flesh out the environment more. So playing with like flora and fauna of what's living there, so nothing feels static. You might be in some ruins, but what's grown over those ruins? What's living here? What are the layers of history? Just, it's so much fun to play with those, and you can do quite a lot to just like bring it to life.
Those moments are also, just going back to what we just talked about, a good way to provide life or show life and show variety when you're going back to the same set.
Yeah, going back to that hub concept idea for Ty and Ryan, that hub concept idea, you might need more moments than you would normally. You might want to get like a nice good list of them. But yeah, sorry, Gabriel, what was
I've seen, I'm not thinking of any specific examples, but a lot of incursions have really cool moments of just random, not even NPCs, just other people living there, or monsters or signs of life just strolling through that are just completely unexpected, but yeah, it brings it to life. It doesn't have to be important, but those can really just like draw the players in really fun ways.
Yeah, as far as like like we're turning it over to everybody here, I think to some degree, like writing moments, and the overview to some degree as well. It's just like a creative writing exercise, right? Like there may not be too much like advice we can do here, but does anybody have any questions about like moments or overview, or like specific to your incursion or otherwise? Colin, go ahead.
Just kind of a quick comment on maybe how you approach moments differently in dark and gold, because I think my read was they seem kind of have different weight in those two. Just quick thought on those.
Jesse, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, so the way that we have done it sort of traditionally is that moments in dark are universal. There's one set of moments that are used throughout the whole incursion. And so sometimes those I think are much more keyed on theme for dark than they would be on gold. With gold, it's really more about just like setting the tone of that specific set. Yeah, I think that's my major thought. Jason, do you have anything else? Or Gabriel, do you have anything else?
Everything does more work in dark, so it's just
Yeah,
kind of unavoidably the case.
I think the other cool thing about writing moments is like you can be poetic about it. Like it doesn't, I mean, not to be too abstract, but things that really grab me when I read an incursion too is like, that's just beautiful. That gives me as the reader who's going to run this incursion ideas. And it doesn't matter if they get used or not, or how they get used. You can just like go heavy on the tone that you're going for and not worry too much about how it's going to show up, because the GM and players will do that.
100%.
I was just going to say, moments are always the thing that sticks with me after reading an incursion. Always, always, always. Like they're just that's almost always where the most beautiful pieces of writing are. You're really right, Gabriel.
Yeah, and to some degree, going back to my basic theory of adventure writing, there are utilitarian aspects for sure, and Trophy Gold maybe has even more of those in other types of dungeons. But ultimately, what you're doing is you're giving a survey of the environment for the GM, and so that the GM can kind of do things on the fly and improvise as needed. And so the moments are a great opportunity to really paint the world for the GM, right? To really, really show them what it's about. Even if it's something they're not going to use directly, the inspiration is usually enough to go on. Like when I'm running Trophy Dark, this is about dark specifically, but when I'm running Trophy Dark, I carefully read through and internalize all the moments, because that's kind of like, that's me onboarding into the environment, right? That's me like getting my brain locked in for that place, and it's a similar thing with gold for sure. I think they do a lot more work in dark, but it's definitely important in gold. I say that though, but honestly, like gold does, in a different way, gold does tap into the various elements of the set a lot through the hunt roll, right? Because the hunt roll, 5 out of 6 times, you have to say something terrible. And like Jesse said, the moments are a great spot for that, but really, truly, like every part of the incursion supports that, right? I mean, it's just there's kind of no getting around it. But dark vis-a-vis gold, which is kind of what Colin was asking about. In dark, you definitely have to. I think in dark, it's a much more. They just do a heavier lift in dark, in my opinion, right? Like in running it, like you just have to do so much. They just do so much more work for the GM, because there's not as many little tools for the GM to play with, So. Any other thoughts on overview or moments? I mean, I don't know how much more there's to really say about them personally, but I think we could probably go to, what's the next part of the incursion here? Props, yeah, props are the thing. I mean, so what do you think about props, Jesse? What was your
so there? So with props, one, obviously make sure you're telling everyone what is there, right? That's just the most important thing, so they know what they're interacting with. The other thing is and this is, you'll see this happen in some of the newer incursions that are going to be coming out, especially in the gold book, but bold like what the important thing is, like what they see right up front, and then either in parentheses or italics or some other way to offset, like show what the treasure hunters will find if they explore it more deeply, right? Give them the overview of like what's there, and then as they get into it, show them, like provide details for when they interact with it, right? And that could be things that are hidden about it, or things that are obscured because of how the prop is positioned, or just like what can they find, what when they interact with it, what is there beyond the traps and the treasures. Like just make sure you're give them something for looking at it.
Yeah, Gabriel.
Another area that's just same with sets. You can telegraph, you can tell a whole lot of, or imply a lot of story with them, which is fun. And it's another cool area to just experiment. The way props can be huge, they can be small. Like for, I don't know how it worked, but I tried to make props whole sections of a city in one of my sets, Leviathan's Bridge, just because I was trying to cram a lot into there. But people have made sets that are what was that incursion that was like that magical box?
It was like a whole just an object. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And like, so yeah, you can, it's just amazing how much you can experiment with that. And I've been trying to use what Jesse mentioned too, where you have what's immediately visible and then what's more details, not even hidden, but just bonus details as you explore it in more detail, is a really useful way to frame it.
I'll tell you what, I made a mistake when I wrote Hester's Mill originally. And you could learn from what I think is a mistake, which is the second set in Hester's Mill is the one where you're on the road and you see the camp, you see the shrine, and maybe there's something else I can't remember. But in any case, what I did wrong there, I think, is I had a separate prop for the statue inside the shrine and the basement portion of the shrine. If I were to go back and rewrite that, spoiler alert, if I were to go back and rewrite that, I would have the details about the statue and the basement portion of the shrine be in the same block with the shrine, as opposed to being separate props. And the reason why that is because for the GM, it's easy, it's better if when the characters arrive at that set, if I just look at the props and say, you see a camp, you see the shrine, that's what you see. What do you do, right? Rather than having to try to parse out, oh wait, these two props they don't know about yet, right? Like they can't see that yet. So I think that was kind of a mistake when I wrote Hester's Mill. I mean, obviously, I've read it a million times. It works fine, but it's just, I think I would redo it. I would have it to be where the props are things that can be pointed out and are easy to interact with right away, right? And then you just kind of bury within that block all the details. Any questions about props or any thoughts on props? Mike, go ahead.
Sorry, having trouble unmuting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the conversion that I did, Godsmith Heresy, just kind of in general, and that was, so in converting this, this was a 32-page dungeon crawl that had about 45 detailed encounter areas, all of which had big blocks of text. So, a very traditional modern dungeon. And so then I just kind of broke it up, and it wasn't completely linear. There was it's a very well done dungeon. The way I had to break it up was in I tried to put it thematically, and the thing about props was the way I broke it up. So some of them just kind of grabbed themes from a bunch of different related areas of the dungeon, and those were my and those I set those as the props. Whereas another area was the set was basically one big room, and the different props were different particular features of this room. So I just think, I guess I had a question in there. I had a question in there when I raised my hand, and it now seems to have evaporated. So I guess I'll retroactively say I guess this is more of a comment than a question. I guess so. I guess the question was, so when you're doing this, like what? So are there guidelines on how, like, you know, on how expansive your props should be within the set? I guess. Yeah.
I will say that I like for them to be things that like can all be observed at the moment, but you know, for varying definitions of set, right? Because some sets are very tiny and some sets are very big. So it should just be a listing of all of the things that you think are worth interacting with.
Yeah, I agree completely. And like, I think it's really important, Gabriel touched on this, it's really important to understand that the sets are so dynamic in terms of space, right? The game operates at a level of abstraction that it can support a huge range of scopes and scale, right? And so your set could be a room. Your prop within that room can be an object, right? Or two objects, right? Your set can be a whole layer of a dungeon, right? I've done that. It's Temple of the Peerless Star. It's like there's one set that's like described as twice the width of the floor above it, right? And it's because that abstraction works because Trophy Gold operates in a space that is about that's about theme and feeling and vibe and tone, as opposed to go down the corridor 20 feet and turn left, right? It's not that kind of game, you know? So, and the die rolls support that, right? Because the die rolls and the mechanics, the hard mechanics, don't dwell on stats. They don't dwell on hit points. They don't dwell on, you know, simulationist concerns. And so you can have this nice dynamic space to play with. And so I think it's more important to think about your sets and props in terms of just ideas and what you intend for this to be about, you know. Any
James, did you have a question?
I do. I guess my question is about like a set where it's sort of, there's a lot of things that aren't visible from the beginning of the set, or in fact everything isn't visible from the beginning of the set. What should you say in the overview where you're basically, you know, like if we're talking about a thing where it's possible to simultaneously see the contours of an entire set, even very, very vaguely, if literally everything in the set is invisible from the beginning of the set, what is the best way you can introduce that? Especially like a labyrinth, for example, or something where you enter in and the contents, and you're basically going to be functioning at some kind of meta narrative level to describe the set somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I think the question then is like, what do you want them to interact with, and how do you keep it from feeling too much like a railroad, right? Because I don't think you want to just give them a single option. That feels a little cheap to me. I don't know. I guess I would need a little more information about like what your goals are with putting them in that set, right? And what you want them to be doing.
I guess if you like, in this case, the set I was thinking of is the set has like a prop that's the entrance to the set, and you're actually, it's like a guarded entrance, and then within it there is then another space, and then in the middle of that there's another space, and from the edge of the second prop you can see the third prop, but from the first prop you can't see the second prop or the third prop.
I mean, I think in that case I think it's going to be, I mean, that's really going to be on the GM to figure that out, right? I mean, I think you can write it that way and it's not a big deal. You might include I mean, maybe your overview says that. You can capture that in your overview, right? When the players first enter the space, they see this done, right? And then you sort of just naturally build on what they can see as they explore. I ran this, like, where I'm in the middle of running it, this like kind of like mansion crawl thing, right? And the props that I had, or the things I'd kind of lined out as props in my mind because it was a conversion, they were just like bedrooms and rooms and things, right? Library, kitchen, that kind of thing. And even though they couldn't see all those things, I told them just because houses have these things, right? It's like, like, okay, this is the east wing of the house. There's a dining room, there's a kitchen, there's a salon, and so forth. Even though they didn't physically see all that stuff, I felt okay telling them because that's the kind of stuff that houses have, right? So there's no mystery being like kind of burst there, But for what you've described, I think you can tee it up in the overview, I feel like.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was that idea for like for various definitions of observable, right? Sets are various scales, right? And so if it makes sense to just give them that overview, then do it.
Yeah, Gabe, what were you gonna say?
There was some comments in the chat a while ago about the idea of like the set goal being the key in the lock. And so part of me wonders is if like the props actually aren't visible when you enter the set, should they be a separate set? Like if you have to cross the door to see the stuff, that almost sounds like another set. And part of what's making me think about it is actually the last days of Kova, where there's like a lot of movement between the sets possible. And these are almost like micro sets. They have 1 or 2 props in them sometimes. And it seems to be like that's the way Trophy wants to break it up. And that allows like the non-linear part of Trophy, right? The abstracted dungeon is part of it. But if there's a thing that has to be done to get to the next thing, it seems like it needs to be locked behind a set goal.
That's a good point, actually, and that's possibly something I could do in this case to spin it off, because that would actually allow me to elaborate on the let's say it's an entrance and it has like you have to show your entry card to get in, and if you don't, then it'll shoot lasers at you and the guards will fight you. Basically, is what happens. But it gives me a space if I'm like cutting out a 1 prop set to kind of puff out the set and make it a bit more interesting. I think you might be onto something there about like my problem is that actually I should have another set.
Yeah, could well be. Why don't we go ahead and take our second break? Let's take 5 and we'll come back and do the last hour. Okay. I want to, we can keep focusing on props because it's all part and parcel, but I do want to kind of push forward towards traps and treasures. And in particular, I want to kind of frame it up this way. I have had the chance to read many, many incursions, either through the contest or through things that I publish, and of course, drafts for today. And while this doesn't necessarily apply to the drafts from today, something I notice a lot is there is some confusion about, for traps, what is a trap? What is a per se trap versus a monster? Like when does a monster become a trap and vice versa? And also for a per se trap especially, how much detail do I need to put in the block about what the trap does, right? And then for the treasure, the thing I notice a lot in general is people have not quite figured out the calibration of how much treasure should be in any given space and the value of that treasure. It's really important. It's so frequent that whenever I'm publishing something, I literally go back and change all the values to something that I think is more appropriate, right? It's like, no, you're not getting 10 gold here. It's going to be 3, that kind of thing. Now, a lot of this is because we've never laid out specific guidelines, right? But I do want to get some thoughts just on from Jesse and Gabriel, like traps and treasures. How do you approach them? What do you think about in terms of like scope and scale and what we present on the table?
I always first just connect them to obviously what is the logical consequence of the prop itself, like what makes sense to be here conceptually. And I always try to make sure that the traps and treasures that I provide like are directly connected to. So for example, you might have 3 whole traps connected to 1 single prop, and that's totally fine. You might have no treasure. You might have 4 different pieces of treasure provided there. One thing that I think is really helpful is just to, the convention right now is to make sure that the trap, if there's a monster listed, that it's like highlighted in some way, right? So you can dive deeper in. But a lot of people are using traps that maybe don't have a monster equivalent, and they're just saying like, triggers a risk roll or something like that. And I think that that's really helpful. It's good guidance for the GM. So just making sure you're doing stuff like that. So it's a good place to include lots of like variable mechanics too, or to say this trap has its own set of rules, see X roll below or whatever. I think that that is also a really good strategy. In terms of treasures, I usually use them as the result on a successful hunt roll. So I don't always just give things. If they explore there, you can. That is totally possible as well if they're exploring properly, but I usually do it as the result of a hunt roll. Jason or Gabriel, you might have different thoughts or other thoughts on that.
I do, but I'm gonna let Gabriel talk first.
Yeah, I mean, I always like to have them make sense in the story as well, like especially if it's a trap. And maybe it's because I haven't played as many, just like old school games where it's like a dungeon crawl and there's a trap. But if there's a literal trap, I personally start wondering like who said it here, why is there this glyph, the flame glyph or arrow trap or something. I like experimenting with that a little bit. Is it just an environmental hazard? Is it a social threat? Is it just that if you're here too long, a monster might show up? So kind of stretching the definition of that a little bit. And then same with treasures, like, is this just a cool little story tidbit where someone forgot their possessions here and it implies story? Is this a ritual object? Is this a really important treasure that's here for a reason? But otherwise, yeah, just having it be there for the GM as some extra, like if someone wants to use a token, here's a treasure that they might thematically find in this location. But overall, just try to make it interesting to me. Like I want to be excited about discovering whatever it is and have it make sense to the incursion.
For me, when I think about traps, particularly per se traps and monsters, right? And of course, in Trophy Gold, the capital T trap means monsters and literal traps, right? But when I'm thinking of literal traps and monsters, I think it's important to understand what is a trap and what is a monster. So if you open, if the trap is I interact with this box and inside there's a nest of cave scorpions, those cave scorpions are too small and insignificant to be monsters, right? Even though they're living creatures, they are not monsters because it's you don't combat them in that way, right? Like they don't. I suppose you could give them an endurance of 1 or something or 2. Like it just doesn't make any sense, right? For them to be like a combat. And so even though they're creatures, they're a trap, right? A swarm of something is a trap. So that's kind of important to know. I also think it's important to note that sometimes there are creatures that are because they're so small or sniveling or because their circumstances are so like vulnerable, that they're not really monsters either. They're more just like colorful NPCs, right? That you have to kind of deal with in some way, right? So that's one thing. Also, as far as like literal traps go, this is kind of piggybacking off what Gabriel just said. I think it's less important that you go into the details of what the trap does than you go into the details of telegraphing the trap, right? Because the details of what the trap does, that's going to be sorted by the risk roll, right? Like, because on the risk roll, the players are going to say, this is what happens if you fail, right? That's going to fill in the fiction of what the trap does. So you can just put poison needle trap or exploding rune trap or whatever, right? And the risk roll procedure will handle the details of it, right? What you can do though, which I think is important, is to telegraph the trap, or at least put details in there that telegraph the trap. Because going back to this idea of GM support, the hunt roll comes up a lot. You encounter something terrible, right? Happens a lot. And this is another thing you can do for you encounter something terrible. Maybe the trap doesn't spring on you, but you become aware of the trap, right? That's the terrible thing. And so building in that part of the detail, I think, is more important than like, what does the trap do, just in terms of like how the dice interact with it. But those are my thoughts. As far as treasure goes, this may not be like, this may not be like the thing. It's what I do when I'm writing it, but I like for the treasure to average out to about 2 gold per prop. That's usually kind of where I'm at roughly. Maybe that's all concentrated in one prop, or maybe it's spread out or whatever. I also think about the special treasures should be worth more than if the characters just spent tokens to get them, right? Does that make sense? So especially if the set goal is find the Serpent King's treasure, it would be very lame if the treasure was only worth 3 gold, because the characters could have just spent 3 hunt roll tokens to find an equal amount of treasure. So the set goal treasure needs to be worth like 4 or 5, right? Because otherwise they could have just spent hunt roll tokens and gotten individual treasures that are worth just as much, right? So think about that when you're pricing things, I guess. Yeah, I think it's kind of my main thought there on that. We can continue talking about props as well, but I do want to kind of switch over to turn it over to you all now for questions and comments, but focusing on all 3, props, traps, and treasures. So Gabe, go ahead.
Just I had a bit of a epiphany about traps when you were talking about what's fun in Trophy, right? And the idea that like maybe in a D&D or an old game, like the thief fails their find traps roll, the trap springs anyway, right? Like unbeknownst. That's part of the mechanic there. And here, finding the trap, knowing it's there, knowing that a risk roll will have to interact with the trap, is kind of where the fun is, right? And the like, what could happen here? And so I think that helps me be more thoughtful about telegraphing the trap instead of trying to hide the trap so that the trap itself is a surprise.
Yeah, don't hide your traps.
Yeah.
Don't ever do that. Like the fun is figuring out how to solve it, right? Or how to work around it. Yeah.
It looks like Ryan's got a question. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask if it's within the scope of this, how do you all write sets, like all the parts? And by what I mean by that is like, does this kind of flow down the page when you're writing it and it's sort of close to what your final product is, or are you bouncing constantly between sets, just putting a piece in and then going somewhere else? And
I can talk about my process. I mostly just move around. Like I kind of start with an outline of what do I think is going to be here and list out my props. And then I go sort of like top to bottom and left to right, but moving around within that space. So what are the traps that make sense after I figure out my prop and written what's there? Then I think about like, what are the traps that make sense here? If I come up with one before that, then I'll put that in. And then I usually figure out treasure sort of at the very end, unless it makes sense that like the prop is keyed around the treasure, then I'll do that. But yeah, it's mostly top to bottom, left to right, with a lot of bopping around for me.
I outline at the set and set goal level, and then come back and fill in the details. I bounce around from there. So. Any other thoughts, Gabriel? Do you have any thoughts on that? What's your process like?
Same thing, bounce around a lot, mostly just things will move sometimes. I realize something will fit better somewhere else until I guess it feels like there's enough to interact with, and also like a variety of ways to interact with it. So you're not stuck on like, well, they didn't find the one detail of this prop and then nothing happens. I like to just have a cool spread of things that can be discovered.
That's great. Michael has a great question in the chat, which I'd love to get on the call because it's a good one. And maybe something we haven't really addressed much in this sort of trophy, kind of broad discussions that we have in different places.
Yeah, so this was something I got into trouble with a little with alluring because I wasn't really sure how to make it fit the mechanics, but I created 2 sets, each of which is populated with a key NPC that had knowledge that I wanted to treat as treasure. So I was trying to invert some of the wander around, find a valuable thing under another thing. And I wanted to use game mechanics to prompt the treasure seekers to interact with some of the people that were here, but there's not a lot of, I didn't think it was necessarily clear how to use a hunt roll conversationally, for a social role. And so when I ran it for players, they just ended up talking to the NPC and they got the information. And I realized that that's a valid way to do it. But if I'm putting an NPC as a prop, meaning they should be kitted out with traps and treasures, are NPCs less likely to have traps? Or how do we broaden the definition of a trap to mean something that can be foreshadowed when you're talking to an NPC to realize here's a way that you could get into trouble if your negotiation or conversation goes awry?
I want to add in real quick before others speak that you don't have to have a trap and a treasure with every prop, just as a point of order there. But I like where you're going with that, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think having characters as props is super great, and people should do that. It encourages fun role play. To Jason's point, yeah, you obviously don't need a trap or treasure to be associated with it, but if you want one, I mean, I think that the question is like, how do you telegraph that? Does that come in through moments? If this person is particularly physically dangerous, are they sharpening a blade or something, or you notice them like pull out and start playing with a knife that they weren't before, and so that's your telegraphing of the trap, right? That they're physically dangerous. Is it have they gotten information about them already that could be relevant? I think it depends a lot on what the threat is, but ideally the trap is something that is going to push towards a potential for a risk roll. So like what are the things that could lead to that kind of mechanic being triggered?
Brian, go ahead.
Brian?
I feel like some of that could be solved by just merging traps and treasures into a single category, rather than trying to have separate entries for traps, separate entries for treasures. Here's some stuff that has a risk factor and a reward factor tied together, and this NPC is in here depending upon how negotiations go. They are a boon or they're a bane, and to me that would help a lot.
That's a great observation, and you can pull that out of the prop trap treasure structure, right? Leviathan's Bridge, for example, which is Gabriel's incursion, is really, really great at like the way it handles NPC interactions, and in particular how it ties those NPC interactions to the mechanics of the game, right? So if you're willing to add like a mechanical layer to the interaction, I think you do that if it's a very important NPC interaction and you want it to be something fun to engage with. You can pull it down and make it its own thing, right? So in Top of the World, which is the rooftop running incursion, the way you interact with the guards is a separate thing. It's not in the props, traps, and treasures. It's a separate like rule, right? You can do that with the NPCs. You can have it be like, here's a separate rule. In Gabriel's incursion, one of the monsters you fight is Grandmother Green Teeth, right? And it's not a literal fight. It's a social encounter, right? It's structured as a combat, right? You can do things like that. I think you do that when it's a very important encounter. I don't think you do that with every NPC, right? But that's just kind of to your point, Brian. Like you can pull it out of the structure and make it a separate thing. The game's not going to break if you do that.
Yeah, that brings up a bigger point, which is like the outline is there to help you, and at the point that it becomes shackles, like let it go and do something different, right? Like if it still fits within the general flow of the game and makes sense, like experiment. That's the only way that trophy or your individual incursion or anything else will get better, is by breaking things, right? When it doesn't make any sense, when it doesn't make sense anymore, break it and try something else.
Yeah, Ty, go ahead.
Yeah, I wonder if you could get some mileage out of an NPC as a prop, and then including sort of their disposition in a trap one section and a treasure the other section. Like, you know, in ours we had one where if you don't sort of speak civilly to the person, that's the trap, so that triggers them. So I think like going back a bit to including story in all three of the things, like you can also include, you know, aspects of the NPC in all three of them too, so you don't just clog a prop with like this huge thing about the NPC.
There's a pretty common like OSR convention, which is like including an NPC's wants and do not wants, and that makes total sense as like a proxy for traps and treasures. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I love it. Any other questions about props, traps, treasures, Gabe?
Yeah, I was just gonna offer that with the social hunt role, I've had a chance to run more Brindlewood Bay than I've run Trophy Gold, and so it just seems exactly like the meddling move. Like at a certain point of the discussion, okay, you're trying to find something out. That sounds like a hunt roll. Like instead of just, "Hi, how are you? Let's have tea," right? You're actually like looking for something now, and it brings me back to the prompt in Trophy Gold of when they ask questions about the world, and that can be social as well as let me go break pots.
Yeah, definitely. I published a blog post, or I didn't publish it, but we had a blog post that I wrote about the hunt roll, about the Trophy Gold hunt roll. And one of the things that I emphasized in that, and I think this is more GM advice, but I think you could definitely kind of like use that as a foundation for when you're writing your stuff, is it's really important in play that the character there's like two parts to the hunt roll. One, how are you exploring? And two, what's your goal in exploring, right? And if you don't have both, it's not a hunt roll, right? And so when we're talking about NPCs and social encounters, it's a similar thing, right? If they just walk up and they're talking to an NPC and it's unclear how to the GM how they are, what they're trying to accomplish, the GM should stop and say, "What are you trying to accomplish here?" Right? And then once they tell you, now we're getting into hunt roll territory, right? That's how Brindlewood Bay works too. But there's that part of it's important. Now, how you sort of take that sort of gameplay ideal and support it with the writing of the incursion, I'm maybe less sure about. But I think it's important to understand how the game is intended to work, though, for sure. You know. Any other comments or questions about props, traps, treasures? James, go ahead.
Mine is so I have what I think is maybe like I'm basically creating extra words and redundancy in my incursions, but I often in my treasure, what I do is I say, yeah, well, sure, you could extract this and it would be valuable. Basically, trying to almost like tempt people into wasting time and doing risk rolls, trying to extract things that are of value out of a prop. But I'm just wondering whether that's a kind of no shit kind of thing where it's better to just leave it as having no treasure and just leave it up to the players to figure out if they want to try and salvage some like whatever elements of the prop. I feel like I'm creating words that don't need to be there just to essentially try and like tempt players into trying to mine sets.
I actually think that that's worth including, if for no other reason than to have it be a note to the GM that this is something that they could want to harvest, right? Someone will ask about it, and if it's not there, a GM may not consider it. And so I think it's actually worth having that.
Yeah, on the kind of inverse of that a little bit, I would say that like even if you don't include those details, players can spend hunt roll tokens if they want to make it important, right? So it's on them. So that's the beauty of the game. So,
it's also a fun way to build in complication. If you're like, you could take this, but someone's going to notice, or to telegraph that too, just to add some extra layers to it if you want.
Absolutely. Colin.
I was just thinking about the treasures that are attached to the monsters specifically. Like I noticed some of the incursions included, like this is what could be harvested from the monster as kind of treasure, and some didn't. I just was curious, how you guys felt about that. Is that something that should always be included? Does it sometimes fit? I mean, just thoughts on what you can harvest from monsters, the treasures attached to the monsters themselves.
I go back and forth on this, so I'll let somebody else talk.
Yeah, I mean, I think so we didn't include those originally, and then people started including them, and I think they're a great idea, just as like a good thing to have there. I also just always like asking the players, what do you think you can get off of this, or what's valuable?
I think
just because I think that's a fun bit of world building. Yeah. But I don't think it's bad to include those. Again, usually they're short. It's like, less than a sentence. So
yeah,
there's no huge harm in including it.
It's an opportunity to tell the story of your dungeon too, right? I mean, it's kind of what we've been saying throughout this whole call. Like, it's another way to like tell the story of this environment, and it's not going to break it if you include stuff like that, right? It's going to be perfectly fine.
I found most players are interested in creating the world around the monsters, but usually like to be surprised in terms of what the treasure is that they're getting. That's been my experience anyways.
I want to, I think I want to kind of push into monsters. That's a good segue. Push into monsters a little bit because I think there's a real art here in writing a trophy gold monster, and we probably don't have enough time to go into like all the particulars of it. But I do want to check in with Jesse about like why do monsters work the way they are? What was your design goal there?
So that's probably a bigger question about like why combat is the way it is.
That is true too. Yeah.
but the endurance, obviously, it makes sense to try to make combat work how it does, and it's a nice tie to how morale works in kind of old school D&D. The first thing is like, just don't ever say the name of the monster, right? Unless it's like a properly named monster that they know about, like Melfast. Let the players come up with what they want to call it, just because that's fun. And I think that that's a good bit of world building. You know, give it the description, make sure that that's important and short and punchy again. The habits are useful for when you don't have a long description, right? Like most monsters in Trophy don't have a big lead up, and so it gives opportunities for how the treasure hunters might be running across the monsters and what they're doing. So that's the value of those. Defenses are, in my mind, are things that inflict conditions generally. They could do other things, but those are like the consequences of getting hit during combat. So I try to make those as much as possible focused on the treasure hunters themselves. So for example, you're fighting a basilisk, it doesn't have like petrifying gaze that turns things to stone. It's your body starts stiffening as you harden up, right? Like that's the difference. It's focused on it's second person, it's you, this is what's happening to you. And then weaknesses are just there to help reduce endurance so that you can fight it more easily and learn more about it. And another thing to explore if you happen to go back and forth between town and want to learn more about the monster. So those are kind of all the key elements and why they exist generally.
I'll tell you what unlocked, a big thing that unlocked for me monsters is when you and I were chatting, Jesse, and you told me that the defenses, yes, their powers, yes, their abilities, yes, they do things, but that you should write them in the second person. That really unlocked it for me because I suddenly understood how this is supposed to interact with the game at the table, right? By putting them in the second person, you're saying, this happens to you, this happens to you, right? And I just think it focuses it and makes it an easier writing task. So that's really, I think it's a really, really key insight about that. Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of note about that. Like, I think that's an important part of it. You know, it feels important when you're writing the defenses for sure. Gabriel, do you have any thoughts on monsters? You have some pretty, some stellar monsters in your incursions.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thanks. I think I definitely feel like I want to experiment more and learn more how to do well. I've just tried to experiment. So I had, yeah, like you mentioned, the skeletal mermaid, it's like a monster, but it's a social encounter. I really like playing with the habits. Actually got to peek at Michael's monster generator that's going to the books, and he had some really interesting, unusual habits. And I think that can be a cool way to surprise the players. Again, build tons of story, imply tons of story in that. If you see this horrific creature, you know, if it's made out of strange things and has this horrifying form, that's one thing. But then if it's trying to play with a toy or it's trying to imitate a human voice or something like that, it just takes it to this whole other level. So yeah, I enjoy experimenting with it, and yeah, building story through it as much as possible.
Habits are great because they, again, are hunt roll support, right? I mean, they're totally hunt roll support. If they roll the hunt roll and the result, like it almost always is they encounter something terrible, you can look at the monster's habit and telegraph the monster that way, right? Like, so if the habit is, you know, carefully, you know, carefully arranging its pile of bones or something, right? You could like use that and kind of telegraph it by saying, oh, you hear like the chittering of or clanking of bones in the distance, right? Something like that. So habits are good for that in terms of like you can write them so that they're really good GM support for the hunt roll especially. Also, and like Gabriel just said, and like we've been saying all day, it's a great opportunity to continue telling the world of your story, right? Or the story of your world, the story of your environment. I did the Temple of the Peerless Star, and it's fairly new, so you may not have seen it yet, but there are two different monsters in it. One's the Star Priest and one's the Starborn. And the Star Priest is the sort of like lower order version, right? They're just like the human worshiper of this star. And then the Starborn is when they have kind of like ascended to this like higher level of connection to the star. And I use the habits to make this distinction really clear, because basically all of the habits are things you might overhear the Star Priest saying. So it's like they're saying this or they're saying that. And then the habits of the Starborn, it's the same thing. It's what you might hear them saying, but it's in a language you can't understand, right? And so it's just like another opportunity to tell the story of the place, right? So I just think that's the way to kind of think about the habits. They're really important, like in terms of the narrative.
Just want to chime in again and mention someone was saying earlier in the chat something about the ecology in monsters, and that's another really cool way to think about them. At least for me, it's sort of like, why is this monster here? And just connect the dots for yourself. So was this a monster created from rituals or ancient dweller of this place? Is this just a creature that lives here? It's just part of the normal flora and fauna, and kind of use that to guide what it looks like and what it does.
Okay, so questions or comments about monsters, or really anything at this point? Ty, go ahead.
One thing I really like about specifically monster defenses is creating rules that like substitute taking ruin. And I wonder, like, yeah, if everyone, like, I don't know. I guess it's not a question. It's more just like, it's something I really like thinking about in terms of monsters, because then it's maybe less deadly, but it's also sort of like really gives the monster a lot of character.
I loved seeing those when I was reading through all these incursions. There were a few of those I think that I saw, and I thought those were super cool. I like it a lot.
Yeah, that's a great creative space to be in. Stay in that space. It's really, really good. Gabe?
Similar to that, actually, in the one I did for the contest, I had kobolds that would steal gold instead of inflict ruin, right? And like it's just as painful, because if you can't meet your burdens, you're dead anyway.
Or the ones that were stealing equipment. I saw someone else had that in theirs. That's cool too.
You can also write defenses so they're very mechanically intricate, like I do. Like, if you look at the stat block for the Starlight Serpent, it's like that. I like to have fun with it. Using the base mechanics though, not switching things up too much. Any other questions or thoughts about monsters? Oh, looks like Mike has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about like monsters using magic. So in the one that I wrote, when I was converting two of the basically the big NPC antagonist of the adventure is a spellcaster. So I was like, well, I was initially thinking, well, okay, well he can use he can use these rituals against the party. That was my initial thought, but I'm not sure how that would work mechanically. I mean, other than just to say, well, I guess that's the gist of my question is how do you have like other NPCs use basically similar like rituals the way that the PCs have them against the treasure hunters?
I usually try to set those up as just like defenses, right? How are they directly affecting the players? If they're in the middle of combat, there are a bunch of different things you can do in terms of like they get an additional weak point, or they are taken out of the next round of combat, or they there's lots of things you can do around that. And they can be framed as this is like a slow spell, so you are slowed down and you can't participate in the next round of combat, so there's no extra dark die or whatever. But I think including the names of rituals is fine, but they're going to work totally differently because they are all sort of consequence based instead, and they're not like, you're not rolling dark dice for them, so it doesn't matter in the same way.
I also think it's worth pointing out that, like, in the world of Trophy, it's not like spells in other games where, like, Burning Hands always does this and Magic Missile always does that. I think that the magic in Trophy, the rituals in Trophy, are very personal. That's always been my impression, at least. It's like my character's personal relationship to this and how it works, because it's going to get described in so many different ways. And so I don't think you ever have to think about it in terms of like, okay, what happens if if I give the monster this ritual, what does that mean? I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it's more just, you think about like, what is the effect? You could name it that, right? Like you could say, okay, defense, Burning Hands, but the way you write it is your skin is scorched and bubbling, right? And then that's it. Like, and then you do the combat like normal. And if their ruin goes up, you also give them a condition that is scorched skin, right? Like that's how you kind of handle that, right? Kind of conditions are the answer there. If it's not a combat, that's a risk roll, right? I mean, basically, if you're not combating the wizard and they're attacking you with their spell, that's a risk roll to avoid it. So, yeah. And then the risk roll does all the work. So, any other questions about monsters or anything else? Colin, go ahead.
I was just curious. I know I think we're talking a little bit about ways to kind of warp the mechanics or use them in interesting ways. I was curious if anyone had just seen or thought of any kind of like versus mechanics, because we were talking the ritual, it's magic versus magic or something like that, but that's just not mechanically how it needs to be played out. Can you guys think of times, or have you seen someone successfully use kind of roles against each other, maybe like if the players were fighting each other or something? I just was curious if you would still keep that in defense, or if there's ways of dice.
Or do we have an answer for you on this?
Oh my gosh, yeah. If you haven't seen the contest roll, you got to check that one out. It's going to be in the new rules, but it's been floating around on Discord and a few other places. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. Yeah, people have been having a lot of fun with it.
Cool, perfect. Thank you.
But super solid for Dark and Gold, by the way. Ryan, what was your question?
Yeah, I had a kind of open-ended question. I guess part of what is so appealing to me as someone who's really only read a couple of incursions so far is that it feels like there's room for just about everything. Like the moving parts seem to just sort of like allow so much experimentation. But do any of you feel that there are genre limitations? Like, can you see Trophy going science fiction or something like that? Or do you feel like maybe it just wouldn't handle certain genres as robustly as it could?
I mean, I think we can handle that at a really high level. It's probably a little bit outside the scope of our workshop today, but I do think that like there's a lot of stuff out there, right? People are doing cyberpunk, people are doing sci-fi, people are doing low sci-fi. That's very in vogue right now in the hobby. People are doing I've seen Trophy Gold incursions that are like very like slice of life, right? Like I've seen all kinds of things. I think the system is very durable because basically you just change the names of things. So Cyberpunk Trophy Gold, Ruin becomes, or maybe Ruin stays the same, but like, burdens stay the same. There's no need to change that. Rituals become tech, like cybernetics, right? Like that's the ritual, right? It's the same idea. So you kind of just change the names of things and kind of recontextualize things, and it holds up pretty well. I do think that the game kind of fundamentally has to be about desperation, but that's just my take. I know Mike plays around with the Trophy Gold structure a lot, and I think maybe some other people here do too as well. So if anybody wants to chime in.
It also depends on what you're willing to like keep and drop. I know that some people have struggled with like the golden burdens cycle specifically. But yeah, as long as it's about desperation and like trying to get things that are hard to get, and usually with the idea of like paying off debts, then it'll work seamlessly with just some name changes.
Yeah, Mike points out in the chat that there is a blog post that went up last week, I think, about basically using trophy gold for sci-fi horror modules a la Mothership. I actually haven't read the blog post yet, but
it was good.
I intend to.
Yep.
Yeah.
But that was Darren's, I think, right?
Yeah. It was, yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Like, as far as like conversions go, we're good to talk about that. Or hacks and adaptations, I suppose.
Just that it's very exciting to both hack it and see what other people are doing. I think what's beautiful about it also is that the mechanics are so simple. You're just using D6s. Everything we've talked about, how thematic the game is. There's a lot of cool discussion ongoing and projects ongoing for how people are adapting mechanics, taking them out, moving things around. So
join the Discord. If you're not in the
Yeah.
Discord, get the Discord for sure. I personally think the slam dunk trophy gold thing is retro future cyberpunk. It just feels like the easiest slam dunk reskin of trophy gold to me. Like you have to do almost nothing to it, you know. Matt, go ahead.
So given that there isn't, at least in my understanding, base trophy gold, a mechanic for like running away from a fight, how do you telegraph when the player should run away, and what are ways to handle that mechanically? Because we had a couple of fights in Immemorial where it's like, you probably shouldn't fight this thing.
So this is assuming that they've already engaged in combat, or not?
That's, I guess, a good question, because like there's a thing coming and like it's going to be engaging you shortly if you do nothing, I guess.
Yeah. So just getting away obviously is a risk roll. That's like pretty straightforward and easy. If they've already engaged in combat, I always just after the first dice hit the table, you just say like, are you sure you want to keep doing this? Like, does this make sense? Or once they learn the endurance of the monster, if it's like 12 or sometimes higher, which is terrifying, usually they're like, maybe not. So let's get out of this. Yeah, I think that like just give them the option if once they get into it and they want to get out of it, like give them a way to get out of it. And usually that will just be a follow-on risk roll to get out of it.
I think Hester's Mill has a tendency to do that with Malfast without, having 13 endurance. I've had it when I played it, the players just went, nope. And then I had to roll about 5 risk rolls to actually properly escape from the set.
So few people actually fight Malfast. It's like it's both great and a sadness in a way. Yeah, I think it's actually like I think that question, that's a gameplay question, right? I'm not sure like what the answer is in terms of writing the incursions, because I think the gameplay handles that no matter what. Risk rolls handle most things. And if I'm correct, Jesse, I think there's a little bit of extra guidance going into the book about like
in the gold
stuff
book,
like that.
there's going to be some procedures,
like disengaging from and using rituals in combat's a question we get all the time.
Right.
Gabe, you said you had a question.
Yeah, it's I think it's sort of related to me having written a bunch for myself, but not necessarily for other people. And I think we've alluded to pieces of this throughout the whole call, but of like how much to like coach the GM, how much to like just leave it in the hands of the GM. Like, I'm going to leave the skeleton here. The GM's going to do with it whatever they will. How much to like write for the GM, like that sort of, and some of that's probably just a style question too, but like to make Trophy Gold sing when you pick up an incursion, right, there's probably some guidance maybe that'd be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, Trophy hasn't been around for very long, so you can assume that most people who are playing it have run very few incursions, and I think a little bit of extra guidance at this point is probably warranted. Might be a different question in 5 years, but yeah, I think it's worth having just a little bit of extra guidance there.
I agree. I would say though that remember that the risk roll does so much work in the game in terms of the story, huge amount of work, to where if all you manage to do in the writing is just say here's the thing, and if all the GM manages to get out of their mouth is here's the thing, the risk roll takes care of a lot, right? Like it really does. Like the risk roll fills in the details in a huge way. So it's I don't want to say it's foolproof. I think it's probably more about intention. Like if you want to, that extra stuff should be supporting the GM, obviously, but also it's an opportunity to tell the story of the world as well. And it can also be like support for the hunt roll, right? So maybe thinking about it in terms of like, how does it help the GM, right? But if all you manage to do is just say like, here's this thing, here's what it looks like, the risk roll picks up a lot of the weight when they finally interact with it at the table. So any other questions or comments about the set structure? I do want to say a little bit about conclusions before we go. Why don't we move to conclusions? So the conclusions, oh, sorry, Mike, did you have a question? Looked like you were raising your hand. Okay. The conclusions, I don't know how much there's to say here, but Jesse, I'm curious to get your thoughts on it to kick us off.
Yeah, I think it's mostly about like, how do you, where do you want things to go from here, right? Like, how do you set this up for future incursions? There's usually opportunities, especially in like where you're clearing out a location, about potentially setting up households. It depends on where this fits within the overall flow of the campaign, but setting up households is a good option. Positioning future threats, what to happen, what do you do if like an adversary isn't dealt with, like what are the possible implications of that? I think it's just looking holistically, like how do you set up future incursions, really, more than anything else. Or epilogues if this is just like a one shot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think there's so many ways you can handle the conclusion. It's like the introduction. I think it really comes down to like goals and what you're trying to accomplish. I don't, the sort of reassuring thing about the conclusion is you can't really do it wrong because it's over. So like the incursion's done. Like we've reached this point, hooray. But I think what you can do is, like Jesse said, setting up future things. I like to, this comes from the OSR. I like to highlight a couple of like possibilities, like, okay, if this happened to the incursion, maybe this is a follow-up, or if this happened, then maybe this is a natural follow-up, just to kind of address some things that may have happened to the incursion, understanding that of course it may have turned out really, really differently, but at least it gets the GM's inspiration, kind of gets their juices flowing. A surprising number of incursions, like Jesse said, do open up the possibility of this being the household of one of the characters, or like being a base for one of the characters. So you might think about it in that kind of guidance as well. But yeah, it's a sketch space. It's a space to kind of do what you think you want to do in the conclusion. However you want to end it is going to be fine. But I think orienting it towards like epilogue or what happens next is good. Any other thoughts? Oh, sure. Go ahead, Colin, go ahead.
So I just had a question on you mentioned specifically that household thing, and that's something in the incursions I've written. I did, but I think I was basically modeling that off Hester's Mill because that's just such an obvious piece of that first one I looked at. I was just curious, as part of usually a big campaign is when you'd want to do something. Do people actually do that? Is that something worth continuing to add in? Or is that beyond the scope? I was just, I guess, more asking GM experience. Do people tend to set up households in those? Is that something worth doing, giving them a chance, or is it something like, eh?
Yeah, there's one of the incursions, the one by Natalie Ashe called The Huntsman's Manor. I've run it a couple times, and it ends in this way to where the players can totally keep coming back to the manor, especially if they kind of just make friends with everybody there, as opposed to like going in there and killing everybody. And so and I believe the conclusion opens up that possibility. It's like, you know, here's a way the manor can be an ongoing part of your story, right? I think that's the key, right? Like, you know, I think Kester's Mill does this. I can't remember if I wrote this or not, but I'm pretty sure I put in like something they might want to do at the end is go back and repopulate this land, right? Like, here is a rich arable land that is just untended to. It helps if you get rid of Malfast. No one does, but like, but you know, it's a possibility, you know. So yeah, I think maybe that's you definitely have the space to talk about the possibilities for sure, yeah. And people do it, but depending on the circumstances. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I think a last call for questions or comments before we wrap up the workshop. Anybody have any last closing thoughts or questions? Jesse or Gabriel, is there anything you want to say before we go?
I just wanted to say, if people have further questions or like more specific questions about the incursions you're working on, hit me up on Discord. Happy to chat. I'm sure everyone else is happy to do that as well. But yeah, this is great, and I'm super excited at seeing where all of these go next.
Yeah. Gabriel, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, likewise, I love seeing what other people are doing with the system. If everyone wants to collaborate, or glad to give feedback, or just want to see what you're working on, because it inspires me too. So yeah, be in touch. I'm on the Discord, I'm on Twitter talking about this stuff too.
You can hear me talk about Trophy for literal hours whenever you want, on both the Trophy podcast and the Fear of Black Dragon podcast. And I'm also available on Discord if anybody has any questions about things. Gabe, you have something to say?
Yeah, I would just like, if folks, because we've all read each other's drafts or have access to them at least, like, I don't know if folks want to put contact information into the chat or like something like that, because I know some people are on Discord, maybe some people aren't. So if you want to offer that, like if folks, like for me, like if folks had specific feedback about mine, I'd love to hear it, because we didn't do that part of it, which I get with 12 people or whatever we have, it's not viable. But
I kind of feel like the easiest thing to do might be for everyone to go on Discord, and maybe we have a little room there or something, because I think the chat disappears, right? I don't think this like hangs out.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I'll set up like a writer's room or writer's workshop.
thing. I think that's good. Yeah.
Channel. Yep.
And I'll make a quick invitation to the Discord as well. I just, I know some people don't do Discord, but for efficiency's sake, I just think the Discord is the right move here. It is it's just a good place to be, and it's just easier. Let me put that there.
There is in Discord now, there is a writer's workshop channel under game design. So hop in there and feel free to share out your incursions and ask questions there.
Yeah, there are design channels for specifically for Dark Gold and Rooted, which means games that are based off Trophy. So those are all other design options in there as well. A super great community. This is for people watching the video too. The Trophy Discord is amazing. It's very active and supportive. Super great vibe, and community, like kind of like esprit de corps or whatever. Everyone's very nice. So definitely join us there. I think that's it. Thank you all so much for this workshop. This was great. Very helpful for me, even to just hear all of your thoughts, and I hope you all found it to be very helpful. Jesse and Gabriel, thank you for being our special guests. And yeah, sorry, Jesse, go ahead. So you want to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say thanks for having me, and it was great to chat with everyone. Thank you.
We will be doing probably 2 more workshops throughout the course of the year. I think the next one of those will be set aside for hacks. So just kind of following up on your question, Ryan, we will have a workshop focused on hacks of Trophy Gold. And then I think the next workshop, though, might just be like a deeper dive in particular discrete subjects for Trophy Gold. So we'll probably do something like that pretty soon, maybe in a couple months or so. Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop the recording.